listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for another 3 hours of the most disruptive show in American politics. In the politically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, and we're getting into the headlines. First of all, after this first batch of headlines, we are going into Jamarl's monologue, and after that, we are taking calls. You can call in 202-521-1320. That's the number. But first, in the news, the New York Times yesterday published an expose on President Trump's teen tax bill. Again, that's after he became president, totaling only $750. That's right. President Trump's tax bill in 2017 was apparently only $750 for personal taxes. The information they received reportedly includes details from both his personal returns and from the returns of the over 500 subsidiary companies contained within the Trump organization. Although the article quotes a lawyer for the Trump organization who disputed their analysis, saying that, quote, most, if not all, of the facts appear to be inaccurate, the New York Times nevertheless holds that the documents are accurate and, quote, provided by sources with legal access, end quote. In an editor's note, the New York Times said that although, quote, some will raise questions about publishing the president's personal tax information, end quote, that, quote, the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that the First Amendment allows the press to publish newsworthy information that was legally obtained by reporters, even when those in power fight to keep it hidden, end quote. President Trump has, as of yet, only responded indirectly on Twitter by saying, quote, fake news, in all caps, several hours after the article was published. In our next headline, President Trump on Friday nominated Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court following the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg on September 18th, the Friday before last. Barrett is a circuit justice in the 7th District Court of Appeals and a one-time clerk for the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Confirmation hearings for Barrett will begin on October 12th, according to Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham. That's 2 weeks from today. Graham has said that the Senate Judiciary Committee should approve her by October 22nd. In advance of her nomination, Democrats, including Senators Dick Durbin and Cory Booker, are calling for her to recuse herself from any Supreme Court decisions related to the election. In our next headline, House Democrats are planning to introduce legislation tomorrow which would add an 18-year limit to the terms of Supreme Court justices. The bill, titled the Supreme Court Term Limits Act, is sponsored by Democratic Reps Ro Khanna, Joe Kennedy III, and Don Beyer, and it would provide for Supreme Court nominations in the first and 30 years after an election. While the bill may have a chance in the House, it is expected to fail in the Republican-led Senate. Tomorrow night, Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden and President Donald Trump will debate in the first debate between the two of this election season. Trump called on Twitter for Joe Biden to be drug tested before starting the debate, saying that, quote, his debate performances have been record-setting uneven, to put it mildly. Only drugs could have caused this discrepancy, question mark, end quote. In our next headline, Azerbaijan and Armenia have each declared martial law following clashes in the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh that have killed at least 23 soldiers and civilians so far. Once a territory of the Soviet Union, following the USSR's collapse, the mountainous region of Nagorno-Karabakh became the site of the chief conflict between the countries of Armenia and Azerbaijan. In 1994, the countries entered into a Russian-mediated ceasefire, permitting the creation of the Republic of Artsakh, a de facto constituent of Armenia, which straddles almost the entirety of the region and which remains unrecognized by most countries around the world. On Sunday, the Armenian and Azerbaijani governments accused each other of firing shells into their own territories, with Armenia claiming the alleged attack was a declaration of war. Basically, they each blamed each other. Armenia has declared martial law and Azerbaijan partial martial law, as both countries have begun to mobilize for war. Armenia's prime minister called on Twitter for Armenians to, quote, unite to defend our history, our homeland, identity, our future, and our present, end quote. This is the largest flare-up between the two nations since the 2016 four-day war, which each country claimed as a victory. By the way, we're going to be talking about this in about 25 minutes with Mark Sloboda, so stay tuned. In our next headline, longtime libertarian and retired politician Ron Paul appeared to suffer a stroke on Friday during a live recording of his Liberty Report. After he began slurring his speech during the live interview, Paul was admitted to a Texas hospital for, quote, precautionary reasons, end quote. He is now reportedly in good condition, with his son, Senator Rand Paul, saying, quote, thank God Dad is doing well, end quote. And my last headline this morning, an FBI agent assigned to former special counsel Robert Mueller's team has said that he thought the investigation into Michael Flynn was, quote, unclear and disorganized, end quote. William Barnett was the original case agent in the Mueller team's investigations into Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn. In an interview by the Justice Department on the 17th, that's 17th of September, earlier this month, Barnett said that the factual basis for the investigation was, quote, not great, end quote. He described a, quote, get Trump attitude in the special counsel's office and said that after 6 weeks, he was, quote, still unsure of the basis of the investigation concerning Russia and the Trump campaign working together without a specific criminal allegation, end quote. This came out in a filing from the Justice Department early on Friday last week as a part of the case to dismiss the case against Michael Flynn. You're all caught up. That is the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, I think I know what your top priority is for today. Let's get into it. What's your take on the weekend's event?
Taxes. Let's talk about taxes. Let's talk about taxes. I was amazed by this. You sent this tweet last night, or this chat last night, and you said Trump's taxes, New York Times says Trump's taxes. And immediately reading through, and I'm reading it to my wife, and my wife is like, I'm in the wrong line of work. How do I do that? And I told her, if you lose $1 billion, one, and on top of losing $1 billion, fail miserably at one business after the next for basically your entire life, with the exception of one or two businesses here or there, you could do that. It's ungodly. Trump lost at one point like $1 billion. That part was known. This part gets across the primacy of spectacle. What do we mean by that? The primacy of spectacle, the primacy of unreality trumping any notion of real things. In real terms, you had a situation where a man fails so righteously at business like Trump, and pretty much everything that he put his hands into failed, and yet makes money and becomes a multi-millionaire. You can even call him a billionaire, not at real estate, the thing that he was doing, but at publicity. Waking up every morning, failing miserably with a vice grip of hundreds of millions of dollars coming due anytime soon, and still say, I'm Trump, and I'm worth gold, and go out there and sell it. Meaning, the indictment of our society to some degree, that a man that has failed this righteously ends up getting nearly $1 billion brand off of a brand. Not the reality. I'm fascinated by this. And by the way, this wasn't just from the standpoint of business. Donald Trump right now is your president. The Apprentice in and of itself was based on this idea that this guy was somehow profitable. This guy was somehow great at business. This is a man's man. This is Donald Trump. He's a businessman. And that's what we need to get into president. Now, the wild part is, I've made this point before, that there was reporting that Trump had no expectation of winning the presidency. And what this gets across to some degree was that he got into this race to boost his brand, because his entire thing that he was selling was only his brand. How weird is that? How weird is that? And think about what that says about your society. That this guy, lifestyles of the rich and famous. This guy, Donald Trump, a man's man, a businessman, a successful man. The man who we need to be president to get in there and kind of get things done like a businessman does. And he has. What he has done in office has basically been the same thing that he's done over the course of his career. Fail miserably, while still waking up every morning saying everything is great. You should read all of this. It's utterly and entirely fascinating to get an idea of what goes on. And by the way, whatever you want to may think of Donald Trump here, this is probably more normal than I think you realize. Donald Trump, over the course of 18 years, I think he paid taxes maybe 10 of those years. And because his losses were so monumental, he was able to basically go back in years and just say, hey, because of my losses in previous years, I shouldn't have to pay anything this year going forward, with the exception of The Apprentice, because The Apprentice was successful, and that was a boon in regards to cash. And after The Apprentice, he goes on a buying spree and starts to fail miserably again. This is astonishing read by the New York Times. One thing that you need to realize, the richest 1% responsible for 70% of all unpaid taxes. This is normal. You need to understand that this is normal. This is normal. As wild as this is normal. The richest 1% are responsible for 70% of unpaid taxes. ProPublica last year found that the IRS now audits poor Americans at the same rate as the top 1%, due in part to the cost of examining the tax returns of the rich. Meaning, when my wife was like, man, if I even hold $1, I'm going to get audited, I said, because they don't audit the rich like that, because it's difficult to do so. Now, think about what I'm saying here. The government, with all the resources in the world, spending trillions of dollars, bombing and killing and all of this other stuff, and on a whim, can go into another country without anybody asking how much did that cost. Can drop bombs. Obama dropped so many bombs, I think it was like over 20,000 bombs. Nobody asks how much do those things cost. They just do it. In this very specific case, the IRS can't come up with enough money to tax or to go into the tax returns of the rich. The interesting part about this, though, unpaid taxes from 2011 to 2013 averaged around $381 billion per year. Think about what I'm telling you. That is student loan. That's students. That's college for everybody. Anybody that wants to go to college. Just in the money that they are hiding. And this doesn't even touch the $7 trillion that's offshore. What I'm trying to tell you is you just so happen to get a billionaire president. And in seeing the tax returns of the billionaire president, people may be astonished, they may be shocked, they may be horrified, but the thing that you should be horrified by is not of the returns per se, it is that it is normal. When you looked at Clinton running in 2016, and WikiLeaks published all of those things about the Clinton Global Initiative and all of that stuff, did you get a chance to look at the Clinton Global Initiative? Because some of the accounting tricks will look familiar to you. Donald Trump, as president, is getting money from institutions and people that he is basically interacting with. So Republicans and groups that may want to gain favor for him will stay in his institutions, which becomes a boon to his bottom line. On top of that, other governments that also wants to ingratiate themselves to Donald Trump find ways to get money around to him or through his business ventures, even though they would say, hey, everything is above board. We're doing everything through the right channels. Clinton Global Initiative, same thing. Donald Trump allows his wife to be a consultant and gives her a ton of cash as a way of, keeping money in the family. And you would see Chelsea Clinton complaining openly and asking questions and people saying Chelsea Clinton needs to shut up. Does Chelsea Clinton know that some of the money from this initiative went to her wedding? Basically telling her she needs to keep quiet and stop asking these questions. The money that was coming from foreign governments. Oh my God, Saudi Arabia. Documentation that Clinton says these guys are terrorists, and yet taking all of this money from these groups. I'm making the point to you that this is unfortunately more normal than what you would otherwise realize. And it's just so happened that they were able to get their hands on it where you could see it and be horrified by it. But the thing that you should be horrified by is, yes, oh my God, this looks massively illegal in regards to the things that are going on in Trump's tax returns. And secondary, oh my God, how can this be so normal? How can this be so normal? One key provision in this. Bernie Sanders yesterday comes out and makes the point. He says, shock of shocks. Donald Trump, the self-proclaimed billionaire, received a $72.9 million tax refund from the IRS while not paying a nickel in federal taxes in 10 out of 15 years. That's true, by the way. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, 2016, 2017, paid $750. I paid more than that in taxes. You paid more than that in taxes. My mom probably paid more than that in taxes. And I don't even think she works per se. I guess I'm making the point that Sanders says this. Oh, burn. Why am I pointing this out, though? That $72 million that Trump was able to get was put in by a provision that Barack Obama, signed into law, the Democrat. Meaning Trump was able to get this massive sum of cash from money that basically Obama put in as a Recovery Act. Yeah, both parties. 90% of the elections are won by the side with the most cash. What do you think that would mean from the standpoint of your laws? Especially if you don't have anything pushing back on those laws. Those laws will find themselves, amazingly, almost magically, going in the direction, like a plant to the sunlight, of the cash. And so when you wonder, how do they get all of these tax cuts? How do they get all of these policies? How are they able to worm money around in this way or that way? How are they able to drop money off? How was he able to get $72 million? Thanks, Obama. One last point for this. The question at the end of this is, does it matter? Meaning, does the society that has allowed spectacle to triumph over any real thing, does that society care about this president's taxes being displayed in lieu of everything else? And I have to be honest, I don't know. Nor do I know what that means if the public doesn't care. Let's talk about it when we come back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and we are taking calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. Jamarl, I want to respond to your monologue for a second. We're talking about Trump's tax returns. The New York Times article paints a picture of a man who's basically propping up his image and brand, spending, millions, tens of millions of dollars in some cases a year.
And in a vice grip.
These luxury real estate deals on golf courses. Yeah, and at this point, in a vice grip, apparently, because, The Apprentice, which made him a bunch of money, he's not making nearly as much money from that. And following having received all that income, he reinvested it in properties that are now losing money. Now, his argument was, and I'm sure is going to be, that he was basically doing that to lower his taxes. I mean, as far as I can tell, it's a pretty simple model here. He's spending a bunch of his excess money on property that will keep up his brand. And then at the same time, he's lowering his taxes because he's losing money on that, which he can then get, basically it helps him to save taxes. That's my understanding of things. That's the argument that he's going to make. It's slightly more nuanced, and it might be something slightly more nuanced for people to respond to. But of course, still the question should be asked: should that kind of thing be allowed? What's the process? I guess his argument has always been the system is corrupt, and he came in to fight it. Of course, the question I would ask is: has he done anything to actually practically change it, or has he only extended the deep tax cuts that, like you were saying, Obama deepened after Bush? What's your take, Jamarl?
No, I agree with you. It's a fascinating read. I mean, because it is, to some degree, asking the question of, wait a minute, why is this allowed and why is this okay? And is there illegality here, or does this just look bad? And if it just looks bad, oh my God. You know what I mean? It's kind of like the Breonna Taylor thing. It was like somebody goes in, they kill her. And then the question becomes, well, wait a minute, did they do anything illegal? Despite the fact that this looks grossly immoral. It's that angle. And so the question becomes, as bad as this looks, it looks like there's a man in a vice grip. It looks like he boasted his brand. And here's the thing, though. If Trump could have succeeded at those properties, he would have. I hope you understand what I mean, right? Like, Jeff Bezos doesn't go through buying companies for those companies to fail. It's a last resort to use the failures of the companies to kill your tax burden. Otherwise, you would just be successful in business. Because he would have made more money being successful as opposed to being a failure, right? Yeah, okay. So I'll say it this way. I think all things being equal, if Trump could have succeeded, he would have. I think at the end of it, it became somewhat of a fail-safe of, all right, that didn't work. I'm not good at this, but I am good at selling my brand. And so that's what I think he ended up doing. I mean, some of this stuff is phenomenal. Some of this stuff is phenomenal. Let's go through some of it. Mr. Trump paid no federal income taxes in 11 of 18 years that Times examined. In 2017, after he became president, his tax bill was only $750. He has reduced his tax bill with questionable measures, including a $72.9 million tax refund that Obama gave him that is the subject of an audit. That's being audited right now. And if Trump loses that lawsuit, he would have to pay that money back. And on top of paying that money back, he would have to pay that money back and pay interest on that money. And as Shane made the point, it's a vice grip. I mean, because if he leaves president, once he finishes presidency, many of the bills will come due to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars. Right, Shane? I mean, like, the impression I got of this was it takes a lot to manage all of this in order to keep it afloat.
You're right. Yeah, three.
Yeah, it just takes a lot, right? I mean, it's.
But it's also, I wonder how this is going to affect Letitia James's lawsuit. So again, New York's Attorney General, the big person who's been going after Trump on a lot of the crimes. I'm not going to say crimes. A lot of the alleged crimes, fraud, that kind of thing, featured in this article. I wonder if there's going to be a kind of call and response. I'm guessing that there will. You know, she's looking at the New York Times at what's published in it. She's probably going to incorporate some of that, and I'm curious to hear where she goes with it.
She is likely salivating off of this article. Like, it really is a fascinating read. I mean, like, one thing, no Russia. And I love the way that they kind of just skipped over that part. Because if you remember, the thing was, we need to see his taxes. We need to see his taxes. We want to get to what's going on with the Russian government. And then they put, there's nothing new here on that front. Well, shouldn't that be a bigger story, considering? I mean, considering the last 3-4 years, that should be a much bigger story. But they add the caveat. But this isn't exclusive of everything. Meaning, this isn't the end-all be-all. And Trump could have money stashed in other places that we don't know about. They always had to put the disclaimer in, just in case. But no, this is a fascinating read, to put it mildly. Democrats are going to be salivating. And
even though, I'll put it like this, even though there's nothing new, even though, like you're saying, they briefly mentioned in 2013 the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow. That's where they bring the Russia stuff in. Like, you're right, they don't say there's nothing new, which should be huge in terms of the whole Russiagate narrative. But they do nevertheless manage to spend 5 paragraphs on it in the middle of the article, which I just think is interesting. There's nothing new there, but of course they've got to bring Russia into it and try to tarnish them again, which I see as just a small part of this ongoing anti-Russian narrative, which seems to have been accelerating in recent months. We'll see where it goes.
I love how you counted the paragraphs. I love how you counted the paragraphs. I love that. That's one of those things. It's like you're working on a Russian network, and it aggravates you when they go after you for stuff that you know is bogus, and it's like, oh. How many paragraphs is this? 5 paragraphs. Those horrible people. No, man, like I said, fascinating read. The question is, does it matter? That's the question. It's going to matter greatly to Democrats, just like Hillary Clinton's emails matter greatly to Republicans. But does it matter? Like at the end of this election, are people going to say, you know what, I was on the fence about Trump? Or are they going to be very clear about Trump? Meaning, is Trump one of those people that indeed that creates a sense of, I'm uncertain, and so I'm going to wait till more information. Or it's love him, hate that guy. Like, it's very clear in your emotions and instincts about your perceptions of Trump. So does this matter? If somebody is backing Trump to the hill, those Proud Boys, those guys are out there. And, they're talking about, I think Jordan had a video where they were talking about, like, lesbian America or something that they wanted to create, that Black Lives Matter wanted to create. The weirdest stuff ever. Do those guys care that Trump's taxes are like this? Meaning, do they care that they pay more taxes than Trump in many years? I don't think so. And so that's what I'm stuck with.
Will they care more about that? Do they care more about that, or they just, like you, are they probably just going to continue to resent Biden and reject the fact that he should be president because, frankly, he can't seem to comport himself well at this point. He's grown too old in his years, and you get my point. I mean, is that going to really tally into that calculus? Is that going to matter? I don't know, and I think for many people it is, and I think that the battle lines have already been decided here.
Oh, so you think it is? Wait, so you do think it matters?
I don't know. I'm saying it might. Your question is, are there some swing voters? But I think we already know the answer. There are probably a few swing voters, but for the most part, if you liked Biden, you're going to double down on Biden with this and go after Trump as you have been for the last some odd years. Count years and counting. And if you like Trump, then you're going to defend him and continue to criticize Biden. So I totally get where you're going. My point is, if you already didn't like Biden, you're not going to like him anymore after this. And if you already didn't like Trump, you're definitely going to, like him less.
So it's a
But
wash.
your opinion of him is probably already at rock bottom.
Yeah,
That
so
seems
your
to
thought
be
it's a
how
wash.
things are.
Basically,
Yeah, that's the thing.
God, but it should it be? So let's ask a secondary question. Should it be? Like when I look at society and I kind of make this kind of what is it supposed to do, as opposed to what is it doing now, and the deviation between the 2 points, and trying to make the point of saying, all right, something's wrong here, and that's something that needs to be fixed. Should this? I mean, for a man to lose $1 billion, and to still be able to get a gig that he is success itself, like the epitome of success. Like if success had a child, it would be named Trump. To end up with that, despite losing $1 billion, and then after you get a show firing has-been celebrities, which to some degree would mean that you're above those celebrities if you could fire those has-been celebrities, right? Meaning you get your ego assuaged like nobody's business, despite the fact that you failed at all of it. Does he know that? And for society to look at him as that is the measure of success, should it matter that he's not? Think about what I'm saying here for the moment. This is a man basically who failed miserably for the majority of his life, and he's lost more money than most people would make in 20 lifetimes. And that's if you're being generous. And then he gets picked by society itself as a measure of success, even though he's not. And that is so fervent, he is able to ride that image to the White House. How weird is that? And what does it say about your society? I mean, I'm asking you, Shane. What does that say about the society? And I'm sure there's deeper levels to this and everything else, but just that part alone floored me.
But here's the thing about it. There's almost like a Schrodinger's story going on here, where if you believe that Trump is losing all this money, then he shouldn't have been paying taxes, because if you're just hemorrhaging money, then in some sense the government's going to give you an easier time. But if he's not, if he's just doing this to avoid taxes, then that should be the story. And he's actually doing okay, probably. It's just we don't have a full accounting. You're only looking at his personal finances, but he's specifically arranged his personal finances so as to minimize his tax liability, is another way of putting it. Which is it? And I don't know. And I don't know that we're going to get a clear picture of it. But I guess, do you see what I'm saying? Like the New York Times article is kind of making both of those points, but they almost cut against each other. And maybe they don't. Maybe they don't in the sense that,
I see what you mean. You're saying that basically, look, if you're failing in business, why is the government going to hit you? If I'm running a lemonade stand, and I'm in the red, how much taxes are you really going to pull from that turnip? How much blood you're going to get from the turnip? That's fair. But it seems like a lot of these things are real estate. And in real estate, he's making his losses what it apparently looks like larger than what they're supposed to be. And beyond that point, even using the business for everything. Like everything is a business expense. Trump, I'm the brand, and so everything I do. So if I get a haircut for $70,000, well, that goes on my taxes. If what's her name gets her feet done on a radio show, that goes on the taxes. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. He even had consultancy fees for the wife, which I thought, that's inspired. Look, there's an aspect of this where you look at and you think to yourself, that's impressive. I mean, honestly, I read that, I thought, wow, that's impressive. That's shocking that he can get away with that. But then as you do a little bit more research and scratch the surface, this is normal. This is normal. $7 trillion.
It is.
In the $300 billion, that's not accumulated or not appropriated because these guys are hiding the money and everything else or doing what Trump is doing. That's healthcare. That's education. When people say, how do you pay for it? There it is.
Well, and specifically the consultancy fees you're talking about, I think it was his daughter. I think you're talking about Ivanka Trump, where it was almost $700,000. They're looking at consultant fees that Trump had paid out, where in many years it was like 20% of his income, apparently, on these large projects. He was doing standard building projects, for instance, and he would be paying 20% out of those as consultancy fees. And then what they did is they linked up the amount that he had paid out on these two projects. I believe it was in Vancouver and in another city, Vancouver and not in, I think it was Hawaii, Vancouver and Hawaii. I might be wrong about that. But they were looking at these two projects, and the amount that he had paid out to unnamed consultants perfectly matched the amount that Ivanka Trump had received in consultant fees from a company that she co-owned, which, Yeah, that's ugly. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here, and it's going to take a little while to unpack. I think that's the real story here, is how it affects investigations that are ongoing, the sort of drip of people analyzing the New York Times results. That's what's going to define the next couple of weeks. Of course, it's also released literally 2 days before the first debate.
Yes.
So that's going to be huge. Regardless, though, we've got to go into a break. We'll be back in just a minute with Mark Sloboda. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're talking with Mark Sloboda, geopolitical analyst, international relations, and security analyst. Mark, how are you doing this morning?
Shane, Jamarl, thanks for having me on. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Line.
It's great to have you. All right, we've got some not so great events going on. We wanted to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh and what appears to be an incipient war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This goes back decades, going back to 1994 at the very latest, with I'll paint it as a Russian-mediated ceasefire. But I'm going to pretty much hand it over to you. You know a lot more about this stuff than I do. Can you please paint us a picture of what's going on right now between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the Republic of Artsakh over in the Caucasian Mountains, Caucasus?
Yeah. So this is a long, complicated story. Nagorno-Karabakh has had tenuous relations in the region. It goes all the way back to the Romans and the Persian Empire's delineation of the Kingdom of Armenia at one point in ancient history. Nagorno-Karabakh as a separatist issue goes back that far. It is an Armenian ethnic enclave within the borders of what is today the Azerbaijani state. During the Soviet Union, it was an autonomous city within Azerbaijan. As the Soviet Union started to fall apart and all of these ethnic conflicts on the fringes that were kept locked down by the Soviet Union reignited, Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenians there, they declared independence from Azerbaijan, and of course their intention to rejoin Armenia. Of course, a conflict ensued. Some 20,000 were killed between 1998 and 1994, which resulted in the time as a de facto loss for Azerbaijan and the creation of a line of contact there. There was some renewed fighting in 2016, which resulted in several hundred dead. And then the most recent flare-up was just this July, although that wasn't in Nagorno-Karabakh. There were a few dozen killed between a clash between Armenia and Azerbaijan on the mainland border. And this is primarily a nationalist issue for Azerbaijan. Now, there is a religious element. Armenia is majority Christian, and Azerbaijan is Shia Muslim. But that's a really minor element here. It's mostly about nationalism. And, there are good arguments, you could easily make from both sides. The people in Nagorno-Karabakh don't want to be part of Azerbaijan. They feel ethnically, identity Armenian. And if you are Azerbaijan, you see an enclave of people who not only don't want to be a part of you, but are your long historical enemies within your national borders. And that's a threat to your state sovereignty and territorial integrity. So it's not an easy issue to surmount. But there are wider geopolitical issues. Russia has maintained good relations with both countries. It still has a military base in Armenia, which Armenia keeps largely because it deters Turkish aggression against Armenia. The base is actually very close to the Turkish border in Armenia. Russia still maintains good relations with Azerbaijan. Their military base there was closed down in 2012, but they still have extensive security ties. Russia supplies military aid to both sides of the conflict. Azerbaijan also gets military from Israel, from Turkey, and so on. Azerbaijan has very good relations with Turkey, and Erdogan is definitely has a role to play in this conflict. And I would say that he is very much pushing Azerbaijan to this, saying, we've got your back if you want to make a renewed military offensive to take Nagorno-Karabakh. And there are credible reports that he has sent some 4,000 Syrian rebels, mercenaries, Islamists and jihadists from his proxy forces in the Syrian conflict to Azerbaijan. And there are pictures, social media postings, and reports from the Armenia side that say that this is extremely credible. In the most recent conflict, Russia has called for a cease of hostilities from both sides, while Turkey has declared its full support to Baku, to Azerbaijan. And there is basically, Russia and Turkey are, despite all of the diplomatic rhetoric and the fake frenemy smiles and the continued business relations on the economic side, they are in a geopolitical conflict that has spread. It started in Syria, where Russians and Turks on several occasions have been in direct war, not just a proxy war. But then the conflict has kind of spread out as both sides seek geopolitical leverage for the conflict there to Libya and now to Azerbaijan. And that seems to be part of Turkey's calculus in pushing this forward, is all about leverage in Syria and Libya then.
Basically, renewal of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, because both of these countries were part of it, basically. I mean, it's a phenomenal conflict. I was reading back over this to get a bit of understanding of it yesterday. Do we know what started this? Like, do we know what was the instigating factor of this? Because it sounds, listening to the news reports, it was basically, there's a conflict, people are dying, and there's shots fired. And one report says they destroyed tanks, but there didn't seem to be clarity over the very specifics of what instigated this very specific flare-up.
Yeah, so, I mean, there was this most recent violence in July, but if we're talking in the last immediate few days, the Azerbaijani claimed there were provocations from the Armenian side. And let's be clear, it is basically a frozen conflict situation, and there are occasional artillery shells and sniper fires from both sides on each other that don't necessitate full conflict. But it's obvious that Azerbaijan has prepared an offensive in this. This was prepared. And in fact, the Azerbaijani president, speaking to the UN General Assembly just in the past use, really increased the rhetoric. And Erdogan brought this up as well and declared during his UNGA speech that Armenia was the main destabilizing factor in the region, which is an amazing bit of projection coming from Erdogan, who is definitely the most destabilizing element himself in the region. And Turkey now has conflicts with almost every single one of its neighbors. So they were increasing the rhetoric. This was obviously a planned offensive, and there have been large protests in Baku over the summer. People out on the street, large numbers of people, signs, banners declaring, and the quarantine, the pandemic quarantine, and start the war. That is the scale of nationalist rhetoric and pressure right now. They're saying, we don't want money, we don't want jobs, just give us weapons and send us off to war. And those are protest cries from people on the street. So there is an insane amount of ultra-nationalist rhetoric in Azerbaijan to deal with this. And Azerbaijan is the only country involved that does not accept the status quo, right? They view the status quo as very bad for them. And that's why they've initiated this offensive against Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia is in a bad situation politically. The current prime minister came to power in a bit of street revolution in the last 2 years, and his side has a bit of shall we say, wish to align Armenia more with the West and less with Russia. Armenia is a landlocked country itself, much less Nagorno-Karabakh, and their geopolitical options, of course, are very limited. And right now, they are suddenly remembering that Russia is their only friend in the world, while Russia is still, at the moment, at least at the diplomatic level, attempting to, maintain relations with both sides. There's no question that sentiment within Russia is strongly in favor of Armenia, because Russia, historically, back to the Russian Empire, has been seen as the guarantor of Armenian safety, of Orthodox Christianity there against Islam. And the Turkish peoples, be that the Ottoman Empire or Azerbaijan today.
Mark, actually, one interesting side of this, you're saying that Armenia's prime minister has been pushing more towards the West. I can see this. You can see this in terms of the attempts to get France involved, where Armenia's prime minister briefed France's Emmanuel Macron on this. Can you get a bit into the history there? Why would they be doing that? Why would France be the country they're reaching out to? And what does that signify for this conflict as it rolls forward? Mark.
Yeah, well, there really isn't much historical relations, of course, between France and Armenia, but Macron seems to be envisioning himself as some type of Kissinger-type figure who can solve diplomatic relations around the world, be it Mali, be it Libya, be it Lebanon, be it Belarus. He's declared recently that Lukashenko must go. Why not? Trying to get him involved in this particular conflict as well. Not that France really has any ability even to speak for the EU or NATO on this. And of course, NATO itself is facing a division here because Turkey is a member of NATO, where most of the rest of NATO, this is, even for the West, this is a conflict that most countries find an annoyance and don't want resumed. Right? It is a needless distraction for just about everyone at this point, except possibly for Erdogan, who seems to relish it again as leverage with his other geopolitical conflicts with Russia. But let me just present to you how serious this actually is. Let's talk an absolute worst case scenario, which is extremely unlikely, but Armenia has a military defense relationship, right, with Russia, via the Collective Security Treaty Organization. There is a mutual defense clause, which, if the conflict started to deal with Armenia and Azerbaijan mainland, not just the separatist conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh within Azerbaijan, then Armenia could claim that it is invoking its defense clause, and that Russia and the rest of the Collective Security Treaty Organization should come to its aid. And then you would have Russia in conflict with a NATO member. And although it doesn't meet the absolute technical terms of Article 5 of NATO, NATO would certainly feel some pressure if Russia was to intervene itself if Russia and the rest of the Collective Security Treaty Organization was at war with a NATO member. So in this absolute worst case scenario, a type of World War I invoking of treaties could involve NATO and the Russian-led CSTO in a conflict.
Hey, Mark,
here.
Domino style collapse there, where you have a succession of unintended consequences or potentially intended consequences. We'll be back to talk about where this could go with Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault lines.
Welcome
And we're
to
back.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're here with international relations and security analyst, Mark Sloboda. Mark, one question on this that the first thing, when I first heard about this in a conflict between back and forth, what came across to me, the first thing I thought of was the Armenian genocide and how Armenia as a country itself may approach this. Is there any kind of consequence? Meaning, is there any point of view or is there any purview from the standpoint of Armenia in dealing with a group of them being in this particular adjacent country? Does it affect them in the way that they process what's taking place?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's top of their mind. I mean, besides the historical relations with Turkey, and Turkey is obviously involving itself quite, pushing itself forward in this conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or particularly between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan. But Azerbaijan, of course, is a Turkic people, and the only way to permanently change the status quo here for Azerbaijan is ethnic cleansing again. I mean, they can't keep permanent military occupation of an extremely hostile Armenian ethnic enclave within their state borders, right? The only way they could permanently change the status quo is by forcibly removing the population one way or another from Nagorno-Karabakh, which makes this entire situation, of course, so rather insane. But there's a whole host of factors that are playing to Azerbaijan's side in this related to time. Because in the initial conflict, 88 to 94, Armenia had the edge. They had superior weapons. They had the de facto military support of Russia behind them to a shall we say, aid and supply degree. Even if technically Russia was maintaining diplomatic relations with both sides. But since then, Azerbaijani's economy has grown significantly because of its energy resources, oil and gas, Turkey being one of the countries that is its biggest consumers, whereas Armenia's with a landlocked country, a closed borders and no diplomatic relations with Turkey on one side, and problematic relations to the north with Georgia, which has had a revolution, back in 2003, the Rose Revolution, and it had an anti-Russian government, and there was the conflict there in 2008 between Georgia and Russia, has made trade to the north rather problematic as well. And being a landlocked country, it hasn't had many avenues for economic growth with its main economic partner, which is Russia, which it does not share a border with. And Azerbaijan has used this energy wealth to vastly increase its military. In fact, at one point in the last few years, Azerbaijan's military budget was greater than Armenia's entire national budget. And also the demographic factor, the Azerbaijani population is growing at a good clip, whereas Armenia has a declining population, more of a standard first world issue type thing. So Azerbaijan sees time is on its side and has seen that for some time. And obviously they've decided that now is the time to see exactly how much the military balance has shifted in their favor in this conflict. And remember, it's very hard for Armenia to keep this ethnic enclave supplied, right? That is entirely dependent on the line of a contact right now. You can't exactly airlift, military aid and reinforcements easily into Nagorno-Karabakh, with, of course, a hostile Azerbaijan in a de facto state of war with Armenia. It makes it very resupply of Nagorno-Karabakh and even supply of things as simple as food very difficult.
Mark, could you please give us a brief intro? What is a country we haven't mentioned so much here? What is Iran's take on this? You said Azerbaijan, Shia majority, obviously Iran, primarily Shia country. Is there any affinity there? Do you think they would get involved for those reasons, or are they just trying to stay out of this? What's your take?
Yeah, actually, they're just trying to stay out of this. Iran, despite Iran and Azerbaijan being co-religionists of a sort, right? Slightly different variations on Shiism, of course, but they have vast political differences. They don't actually have very good relations. Azerbaijan has chosen rather to have good geopolitical relations with Turkey and even to a significant degree, even with Russia to the north, better than it does with Iran. And like Russia, Iran has simply called for a halt to the fighting in this conflict and has not taken one particular side or the other out of this. And I don't see them stepping in any particular way in this conflict. Iran does have a very small border with Armenia as well. But again, this is an extremely mountainous area. I mean, Nagorno-Karabakh in particular, but Armenia, much of Armenia and Azerbaijan in total. This is the Caucasus. So it doesn't necessarily make travel between one particular place and another very easy. And of course, it makes any potential offensive on Nagorno-Karabakh from the Azerbaijani side extremely difficult. They're attempting to seize what is in effect a hostile mountain fortress. And despite the difficulties of resupply, the defenders, the Armenian ethnic defenders of Nagorno-Karabakh have repeatedly used that difficult geography to their defensive advantage.
It makes the mountainous aspect makes it a bit difficult to travel. It also makes it beautiful. I mean, I'm going to take a brief excursion. I've for a long time wanted to bike through there, head a little bit further north, try some khachapuris in Georgia. In any event, there's an exclave. So if you're looking at a map, Azerbaijan is sort of notable in that there's an exclave to the southwest, bordering not Azerbaijan, a part of Azerbaijan, bordering Armenia, Turkey, and Iran. How would that change things? I'm guessing that the relationship, the armaments that Turkey providing Azerbaijan is coming primarily through that exclave. It's coming primarily through that non-contiguous region of Azerbaijan on the other side of Armenia. Is that going to affect how things roll out here? Is that just a triviality? It seems like that would make things a bit weirder, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, of course, exactly, the logistics of how Russia would get aid to this conflict, and how Turkey would get aid to this conflict is rather difficult. We've in the past 48 hours, we've seen Russian flights that actually go the circuitous route of avoiding Georgian airspace in this. A big military transport departed Rostov-na-Donu, went out over the Caspian Sea, flew down south around Azerbaijan through Iranian airspace, and up into Armenia to presumably unload some military gear to Armenia, again, despite the rhetorical, diplomatic relations with both sides to this issue. It definitely makes it a problem for both sides, both from if you would say that Armenia is backed, and I would agree with it to some extent, by Russia because of their defense ties, and certainly Turkey's issue of resupply with Azerbaijan, their full-throated support and even goading on of Azerbaijan from their side.
Yeah, I saw the response from Turkey basically blaming everything on Armenia. And I thought, oh, too soon. How are other governments dealing with this? Like, I'm enamored by Erdogan's brashness in regards to all of these conflicts. I mean, I was sitting here, right, like you said, Syria, Libya, Greece, and right here we have now Armenia, who they've had a long time conflict with, going all the way back to the Young Turks. So how?
You have to remember Iraq as well, because Turkey regularly makes bombings and attack into Iraq as well. It's every one of Turkey's neighbors, right? So it's a difficult situation.
But
if you listen to the rhetoric,
I mean, because they don't want it to go to military, but Turkey was using military flagrantly in Syria. I mean, when Erdogan got caught on that hot mic or whatever, and he flipped out saying basically we're going to use false flags in Syria in order to take action in that particular region to go after his enemies. So I agree with you. I'm more curious, like, how are the governments surrounding Turkey dealing with this kind of belligerent Turkey?
Yeah, not very well, of course, because the rhetoric coming out of Ankara, coming out of Erdogan, when he speaks to his own people in Turkish, is insane. I mean, it is not just ultra-nationalist. It is both Islamist and neo-Ottoman to a very significant degree. And, he is under domestic pressure because of the bad economic situation that Turkey is facing, the falling Turkish lira, a stagnating economy coupled with, not exactly stellar handling of the coronavirus pandemic. But he has his military adventures in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq have paid him domestic dividends. And that is certainly one factor he's continuing in trying to drive this forward, and offering such full-throated support and goading of Azerbaijan in this. And certainly Greece is absolutely horrified by the militarism and is continually facing violations of its airspace, potential naval threats, the claiming of energy resources that by any stretch of international law, Turkey doesn't have any rights to in the Mediterranean, because of the whole Cyprus issue.
I wonder,
it's a real mess. But there is a wider
just real quick, is this an issue of Turkish identity? Like meaning it paid dividends, but it paid dividends because they would have had to see themselves in a particular way. And we have about 30 seconds.
Absolutely. That's the two cards that Erdogan plays: nationalism, and as neo-Ottomanism and Islamism. So he plays them both at the same time, and that comes out here with Azerbaijan seen as a brother people. But no one wants to take action against Turkey. Neither the U.S.-led West or Russia, because both are so afraid of seeing Erdogan move Turkey geopolitically permanently into the other camp. Turkey has problematic relations with NATO in the last few years.
Mark,
Russia,
we have to cut it here, but I really do appreciate you coming on. This is Mark Swoboda, international relations and security analyst. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment. Mark, thanks again for giving us information on
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, the New York Times yesterday published an expose on President Donald Trump's tax return data, which it says paints a picture of a quote-unquote businessman president in a tightening financial vice. The New York Times says the data in it given shows that chronic losses and years of tax avoidance, with Trump paying no federal taxes in 11 of 18 years that the Times examined, with his 2017 bill totaling $750. The information they received reportedly includes details from both his personal returns and returns from over 500 subsidiary companies contained within Trump's organization. Although the article quotes a lawyer for the Trump organization who disputed the analysis, saying most, quote-unquote, if not all of the facts appear to be inaccurate, the New York Times nevertheless holds that the documents are accurate and provided by sources with legal access. In an editor's note, the New York Times said that although some will raise questions about publishing the presidential personal tax information, that the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that the First Amendment allows the press to publish noteworthy information that was legally obtained by reporters, even when those in power fight to keep it hidden. President Trump has of yet only responded indirectly on Twitter saying fake news several hours after the article was published. President Trump Friday nominated Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court following the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg on September 18th, the Friday before last. Barrett is a circuit court judge in the 7th District Court of Appeals and one-time clerk for the late Supreme Court Justice Anthony Scalia. Confirmation hearings for Barrett will begin October 12th, according to Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham, with 2 weeks from today, which is 2 weeks from today. Now, Lindsey Graham has said that the Senate Judiciary Committee should approve her by October 22nd in advance of her nomination. Democrats, including Dick Durbin and Cory Booker, are calling for her to recuse herself from any Supreme Court decisions related to the election. House Democrats are planning to introduce legislation tomorrow which will add 18-year limits on terms of the Supreme Court justices. The bill, titled the Supreme Court Term Limits Act, and sponsored by Democratic Representative Ro Khanna and Joe Kennedy III and Don Breyer, will provide for the Supreme Court nominees or for the Supreme Court nominations in the first and third years after the election. While the bill may have a chance in the House, it is expected to fail in the Republican-led Senate. Tomorrow night, Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden and President Donald Trump will debate in the first debate between the two in this election season. Trump called on Twitter for Joe Biden to be drug tested before start of the debate, saying his debate performances have been record-setting uneven, to put it mildly. Only drugs could have caused this discrepancy. That's going to be an interesting debate, to put it mildly. Azerbaijan and Armenia have each declared martial law following clashes in a disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh and have killed at least 23 soldiers and civilians so far. Once a territory of the Soviet Union following the USSR's collapse, the mountainous regions of Nagorno-Karabakh became the site of the chief conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In 1994, the countries entered into the Russian-mediated ceasefire, permitting the creation of the Republic of Artsakh, a de facto constituent of Armenia, which straddles most of the entirety of the region. almost the entirety of the region and remains unrecognized by most countries around the world. On Sunday, the Armenia and Azerbaijani governments accused each other of firing shells into the territory which Armenia claimed the alleged attack was a declaration of war. Armenia has declared martial law and Azerbaijan partial martial law, as both countries have begun to mobilize for war. Armenia's prime minister called on Twitter for Armenians to, quote-unquote, unite to defend our history, our homeland, identity, our future, and our present. This is the largest flare-up between the two nations since 2016 four-day war, which each country claimed as a victory. It's also important to note that there is a fuel line, apparently, going through this region, which the world does not want disturbed. Longtime libertarian and retired politician Ron Paul appeared to suffer a stroke on Friday at a live recording of his Liberty Report. After he began slurring his speech during a live interview, Paul was admitted to the Texas hospital for precautionary reasons. He is now reportedly in good condition, with his son, Senator Rand Paul, saying, "Thank God Dad is doing well." An FBI agent assigned to former special counsel Robert Mueller's team has said that he thought the investigation into Michael Flynn was unclear and disorganized. William Barnett was the original case agent in the Mueller's team's investigations with Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn. In an interview by the Justice Department on the 17th, Barnett said that the factual basis for the investigation was, quote-unquote, not great, described a get Trump attitude, quote-unquote, in the special counsel's office, and said that after 6 weeks, he was still unsure of the basis of the investigation concerning Russia and the Trump campaign working together without a specific criminal allegation. This came out of filings from the Justice Department early on Friday last week. I would love to get Aaron Mateo on to dissect that, because some of that information that came out of Barnett was utterly fascinating and honestly damning to the origins of the Mueller investigation and to the Mueller investigation in itself. It was almost like a bunch of conspiracy theories. But with that, you're all caught up. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Shane, there are several places that we can go with this, but one was going to be a monologue. But it's something that we could just talk about and back and forth, and for me to get your opinion and feel of. So the New York Times has been doing pretty great work recently, and they came out with a story, how it pledged to dismantle the Minneapolis police collapse. Now, if you remember, the Minneapolis Police Department, or the Minneapolis Police came out and said, we're going to defund the cops, and we're going to make this something fundamentally different than what policing is. Now, the wild part about this is, in making this pledge to defund the cops, my question, if you always go back and look at my old videos, especially those on my channel or those on Political Misfits, I said, fine, I back this, but this is backwards. And that the defund the police thing was too diminutive for the number of people that were marching. Meaning you had people literally all across the world, people in Sydney, people in Germany, people in New Zealand, for God's sake. You had people everywhere in every 50 state marching, saying, we are against this, we don't like this, something needs to change about this. And all inspired by Floyd being murdered and watching him for 9 minutes with a cop casually sitting on his throat. Now, the perspective of BLM and the protests and so forth have changed to some degree and have softened over time. But it was never expected that this was necessarily going to be permanent. The question was, what of this would remain when this was over with? And to me, the defund the police thing misses a very basic point. The reason that cops are there, there's a reason for it. Meaning it's not like cops are there just to be racist, or cops are there just to be oppressive, or cops are there just to give tickets, or just to do this, just to do that. No, your society makes a choice in saying, look, we are not going to deal with the reasons for the violence. We're not going to deal with the reasons for the crimes. We're going to throw in cops. We're going to pay the poor to police the poor. And we are going to get up in the business of doing whatever we do. And you have this situation where the cops were put there in order to deal with the issue of, I would argue, poverty. Yes, crime, but when you get to what is the bare bones reason for this? And if you're talking to economists, they would tell you the same thing. Statistically, you can look at the areas across your country, the areas that are dealing with crime or the areas dealing with violence. Oftentimes those areas are indebted. It's a rational act in those situations, even though people will say, how's it rational? Well, you have people who are alienated. The interesting part here, though, is why did it fail? And it failed for basically what I'm telling you, that you're not dealing with the real reasons. by just saying and take an idealistic point of view that you want to get rid of the cops. If you want to defund the cops, if you want to get rid of them, if you want to stop them from doing X or Y, you deal with it in two ways. One, you have to deal with accountability, but you also have to, and you cannot let your political leaders put all of this on the cops and get away from and deviate from this notion that you also have to deal with the poverty that your country is ensconced in. It failed basically because people wanted cops around. If you ask my mom, if you talk to my mom, she would say, yeah, we need cops here. Why? Because her area may not necessarily be the best. And so it's idealistic to say we want to defund the cops. And if you're talking to various people, they'll say, yeah, get those cops. But if you're talking to real world people and those cops said, okay, fine, you don't like me, you're angry at me, maybe I don't do my job this week. Maybe I don't, go after this guy, that guy. Maybe we just give it a pause. The crime rate rises naturally because, again, the cops weren't there for magical reasons. They were there because you need something to kind of put a box on that stuff. And what happens? People who are calling for defund the police say, where are the cops? And other people laugh at them who call for defund the police asking for the cops. My point is this. The reason that it failed is because it was idealistic in its beginnings. It wasn't about why a cop's there. It was entirely about what cops are doing that are bad. And trying to throw the baby out of the bathwater was not necessarily a strategy, meaning I hate the look of my couch, but I need my couch. And if I want to find something else to replace that, that's fine. If I want to find something else to deal with that, that's fine. But I have to deal with the fact that that couch that I think is atrocious looking is there for a reason. Same thing with your cops. Same thing with your police force. You can deal with those things, but you have to deal with those things from the other end, meaning deal with it from the standpoint of poverty and organically lower it. Now, Shane, you and I have been back and forth about these protests, and I don't think we're that far away from it. And I think we've even been back and forth to some degree on policing. But I think we've been in agreement on the defund the police thing, that it's backwards. And whether it's in New York or whether it's here, where people were chastising and getting on AOC because the crime rate went up, and they're like, hey, why did the crime rate go up? I thought you wanted to defund the cops. Or here. I think you have to deal with it honestly, and I think you have to deal with it from a structural position, a systemic position. What do you think about this? I thought this article was fascinating. I mean, I don't know if you had the chance to read the article, so that's fair. But it's basically...
Yeah, no, I did.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the fundamental problem here was that the call to defund the police is too vague for a lot of people, and it's too harsh for other people. So if you take defund the police as a sort of literal statement, then that's more than practically anybody's willing to go, other than a marginal group of activists. If you take it along, as a sort of gradient, if you take it as we should remove funds from the police, or we should, this is even further away, it's more of an abstraction, or we should reform the police, that's a lot less exciting than defund the police. It's these kinds of things that tend to polarize people. It's these kinds of messages that tend to spread. But ultimately, the problem was it was too vague. And then you bring up the fact that it wasn't addressing the structural issues. That's something that everybody on the ground seems to be complaining about fundamentally. Another interesting note here, it's just weird, just looking back at it literally in terms of the accidents of history. It seems like the city council member, the council president, was actually unreachable for days after Floyd's death. She was like on a wilderness trek. So that delayed things. Then she got back. And all this stuff was going on. The council came together. A lot of people in the council didn't want to go along with it, saying, even if you throw bottles at me, I'm not gonna agree that we should defund the police. Plenty of others, though, I mean, clearly from the majority, were willing and thought that would be a good idea, whatever that looked like. But ultimately, it fell apart because it was too vague. And this is the thing about politics or statesmanship or that kind of a thing. If you're trying to bring groups together to compromise, but what you have them compromise over is too abstract, it's too vague, then you're not actually doing the work. You're not actually doing the work of having everybody on every side make some sort of a sacrifice so that they can come together for a lasting peace on the other side of whatever conflict you're in. I think that's what it would have taken, but sadly, that's not the case. I mean, you bring up protesters internationally. I get where you're going. There's like a moral imperative here, but if you have people around the world calling for this big abstract action, and then when you get down into the nitty-gritty and you kind of can't make sense of what action you're actually supposed to take, it's going to complicate things, and we're living on the other side of that. I think that's fundamentally what we dealt with. We're going to go into a break. Yeah. We're going to come back. Want to get your response. We're also taking calls, 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. That's the number to call. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault lines.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Great barbecue. Also, guys, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and make sure you share it. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement, honestly, really does make this show what it is. So definitely feel free to call in. I only bite on occasion, and I've never been a man that didn't deserve it. So, Shane, we were going on... Look, I agree with you, man, that when we're looking at the protests and stuff and we're looking at this kind of ham-hog way or ham-fisted way of trying to deal with it. So it's like something happens, something tragic happens. But the honest reality of it is that tragic thing happened 1,000 times a year, at least. And 1% of the cops get prosecuted, and of that 1%, 30% go to jail. So let's be honest that the thing that happened that they were responding to so quickly had been happening for God knows how long. Then it becomes a second question of why did it happen? And our society has this weird way of always pinning it on the individual as if that individual acted and solely with the discretion of the individual, meaning it was entirely the person's fault. This guy gets dragged before court. That judge hits the hammer, sends that person away, and gives them a bad speech. You're a horrible person. I'm going to send you to jail. And does that for a living day after day after day for years and never at once thinks to themselves, was that person born that way? And if the person wasn't born that way, what were the factors of their environment and their society that made them that way? That's a larger question. But that's what you have to answer. Like, it's not, for me, when this happened, my thought was, you have to deal with the factors that are around that created that. That's not their issue, Shane. I mean, to your credit, I think your point is, they reacted swiftly. For obvious reasons. People are going to be angry. People are going to burn stuff down. You want to get ahead of it. Fair enough. But what you do needs to be effective and needs to work. And it seems like the best that they're going to get are incremental changes to the way policing is done in the state. And
specifically, I just want to quote from the article for a second here, from the New York Times article that you were referencing that kicked this all off. This is quoting Miss Bender, the council president. I'll just quote again. I'm quoting from the New York Times. When she tried to negotiate changes, she and others tried to negotiate changes, they said. When activists stood their ground, councilors were left with two options: embrace a forceful but vague call to dismantle the police department, or oppose activists in a time of civic chaos, possibly risking their progressive reputations. Quote, end quote. The point there is that really is the option that they faced in that moment. And that's not a good option. Now, there are things they should have done in advance of that. You know, if you, again, I'm not going to put it all on them, because how many people can you really distribute your blame to? We're a national system with millions of people literally working for the state. It's not like, but still, these are the people on the ground who should be doing the things to make things better here. They should have done stuff in advance of this, but still, at that point, what are they going to do? They either kind of go along with it and come come out the other side dealing with this, which is effectively an untenable call. They can't defund the police. That's not going to, again, what you would be left with if you took that literally is vigilantism, which, if you remember, Ahmaud Arbery was part of what kicked this whole wave off, was this idea that you have a white supremacist state, you have people who are going to be acting out their prejudices, and that from the police down to the public, you have, I could argue with that. We could tussle over that. I don't really care to, though. Because frankly, I agree. We need economic changes to actually fix the situation that seems to have caused this.
No,
and there's a deeper conversation there.
No, I do agree with you. I don't think we're in a disagreement on this one. It's fault lines, but I think we agree on this one. It's not enough to, let me say it this way. The left sometimes has a tendency to have magical thinking in regards to how things need to function. And believing that a bureaucratic system in and of itself should be enough to fix it, or that people should have these kind of morals and ethics.
I want to quote you on that. That is a great soundbite.
I have no issue. I mean, we bring lefties on here all the time, and I'm fighting with them. But I say that to say that your policing system, or your economic system, or your whatever, those things, like you said, tend to be systemic. And you have basically a council that needs to come to some resolution about how do we deal with this? Society is angry. They're angry, the mob, and they're going to burn stuff down. And what do we do to try to stave that off? That's their choice. And they chose, we're going to hit the cops. And then after hitting the cops, they're like, all right, this ain't working. And they backpedaled. But like you said, the honest truth of it is there are systemic changes that need to be made for this to work. And I got to be honest, I don't know if the city council in and of itself has power to make those changes done just because of the factors that are on the ground. Like you said, you don't want vigilantism. And if you say, okay, we don't want to have cops, do you remember in those quads, those areas that were lawless? I can't think of the name of them. They were in Washington, I believe, and there was another one, I think, in D.C., a smaller one. Chad's.
There was another one in D.C., yeah, but the Chaz and Chop, right. Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which switched to the Capitol Hill Occupied Protest.
And so the thought became, we don't want cops here. Okay. But didn't they have to end up with cops anyway, like their own community policing or something?
Because they had a militia. They had a vigilante militia spring up to defend people, and it seemed like there was some maybe an organized crime element. But that's just what happens. Again, we talked about this actually, I believe with Dr. Linwood Tawhid when we had him on last week. I brought up this idea that if you don't have law and order in a place, that what you get is organized crime. That's what you get. What you're dealing with fundamentally when you're dealing with the police is the veil of force that intermediates, force with people. This is, again, I'm speaking in such abstract terms that it doesn't make sense, but cops are the ultimate lever of force, including the army. It's like that whole continuum there that would be used by a government. If you're rejecting cops, then in some sense you're rejecting the government's legitimacy as such. And I really think it does strike that deep. I don't think that it's an accident. I mean, people on the right will point out the violent Antifa left-wing activists or whatever they'll call them, anarchists and stuff. And sure, there are some of those, but fundamentally there's a much deeper thing going on here, I think, than just agitprop to get people agitated. It's that we're having a sort of crisis of government in this country. And I think it was inaugurated at the very latest in 2016 with the whole crisis of the election. Many people on the left have argued for years now that Trump is an illegitimate president. Well, if you're invalidating the presidency at the highest order, that's like taking the cap off the pyramid. You're taking off the thing that is supposed to represent the whole. And if you start criticizing that thing on top so stridently, if you reject it outright, then you're going to reject it all the way down. And the bottom of that pyramid, its ability to sustain itself, as far as I can tell, is built on force. If you were to get rid of police, I don't know that you would have immediate anarchy, but in some places you clearly would. And then over time, I don't know how that society would work.
So yes and no. There's a lot there. The rejection of the police is not a rejection of law and order. It's a rejection of being treated like trash. There's a difference. You must understand.
It's a rejection of the state's version of law and order, the current state's law and order. That's what I'm saying.
It's not a rejection of law. It's not a rejection of order. But I hope you understand what I mean by that. If I was a battered wife, and and I have a feeling about my husband doing that, that's not a rejection of men. That's a rejection of him for beating me. Or if you have a government that you feel is keeping you as slaves, for example, or let's say have Jim Crow, that's not a rejection. Does it make sense?
Let me disambiguate real quick. Totally. I want to disambiguate something I was saying. I'm not saying that the people who are calling to defund the police are all anarchists at all. What I'm saying is, if you're rejecting the police, then you are rejecting the arm of the government that is supposed to enforce that law through order. And I'm not saying that you're rejecting government as such, but I am saying that you're rejecting our government. And that seems to be pretty clearly what's been going on here. I mean, very clearly. It's just that the police are sort of the veil or the intermediary. They are the enforcers of that law and order. If you're rejecting them, you're rejecting as much as you can the people in your lives who are going to enforce what the government does. And therefore, do you see what I'm saying? It's like a sort of cascading rejection upwards.
But I think you're going too deep into it.
Seems to fit.
No, I agree with you, but I think you're going in too deep into it. And I think you also need to disambiguate. Are you talking about Democrats? Are you talking about activists, like people who are out there on the streets like the Antifa stuff? Are you talking about people who are out there, let's say, because they're being evicted? Like this, I mean, not to mention the Proud Boys stuff that's been going on with these guys have been having car full of weapons and guns and bullets. Like, it needs to be disambiguated what you mean. Like, if you remember,
I'm talking about all of them. Yeah, anybody, if you're out there with guns with the idea that you're going to keep other people from doing bad, then you functionally see the police as inadequate in some capacity, either because they're biased against you or just because they're incompetent, whatever the case may be. And that is ultimately a deep rejection of the government. That's what I'm saying, and not of government as such, but of our government. And it's very clear that that's what's been going on.
I think in some cases, yes.
The left has.
But in many cases, no. I don't buy that. I just don't buy the argument. Like, I don't think it's... And if you say our government, well, explain. When you say our government, do you mean of the United States government in and of itself, or do you mean of the Trump administration itself? Like, I'm trying to figure out which one do you mean.
Depends on who you are. A lot of the guests we bring on would indict the U.S. government as such, and a lot of them would also just say Trump is an aberration. We can get back to normal. In either event, you can radiate out from sort of how specific you want to be, depending on who you're talking about. Because some people, if you have a deeper trust in the system, if you think things would go back to mostly normal if we were to get Biden elected, then yeah, you're not criticizing the system as such. You're criticizing Trump. But a lot of people, I think a lot of the true believers in terms of the activists are criticizing the system as such. They're criticizing capitalism. They're criticizing the United States imperialism. Again, there are things you can criticize here, and I do criticize them, but I also defend them because I kind of live within them. But do you see what I'm saying there?
I think I do. I just don't think it goes as deep as I think you think it does. Like, I agree with you that it's to some degree an indictment of the system. Like, meaning, when I make an argument, and I'm making this argument saying the government is doing this, yeah, I'm angry at the government for doing that. Am I saying abolish the government? No. Or when I make an argument that cops are doing this or cops are doing that, is that me going after policing in the way that it's done in the United States? Yes. Is that me saying that these guys are maniacs at times? Yes. Does that mean I want to abolish policing? No. Like, I guess, like, it depends on how deep you mean. Like, I don't have my indictment of the U.S. government when I'm making arguments about things that it's doing that I think are atrocious, whether it's foreign policy stuff or whether it's, the having all of these people impoverished. I think there's a difference between that and talking about abolishing the government. Meaning you can have an indictment of one, but the indictment doesn't necessarily go as deep. Because look, if those people were living in situations where, let's say their needs were met, let's say it's not chaotic, let's say it's not a violent area or something like that, they have a different perspective of their government. And so it's like, if you want to say they're indicting their government to some degree, yes, but I don't know what that means in the sense of, are you trying to say they're trying to abolish their government? I don't believe it goes that deep. I could be wrong, but I don't believe it goes that deep. Do you want to go to Tarif real quick, or you want to back and forth?
Let's go to Tarif. Let's just go straight to Tarif. Tarif from New Orleans, you're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I missed the first hour, but yeah, y'all, you talking about the police? Yes, the poverty has to be addressed. And another thing need to be addressed dealing with these city councils is dealing with how they pass these new laws, which the police have to go enforce, which makes more money for the city. And so these police officers and state troopers, sheriffs is acting as tax collectors.
Tarif, wait, Tarif, you're so right. You're so right. Explain that for the moment. When you say tax collectors, because what you're talking about is basically fines and those type of things that they basically use to criminalize the poor and take that money into the coffers of the cities. And the cities basically use that as part of their revenue. And so the cops are incentivized to do it. Is that what you're talking about? That's what I think you're talking about.
Exactly, Jamal. Exactly. It's like, and it's amazing how there's a game that's being played with the councils, with these cities, with the police. They fund the police, this and that and other. But the council, city councils is like 100% with the police because the police brings in money. They make the drug bust. They bring in the dope money and they put that in the coffers. They give you like speeding tickets. They have a town outside of Dallas called Ennis, right? If you go a half a mile over speeding limit, you get a ticket, and everybody in Houston know about it. Everybody, you can't speed through that town. You just can't. And that's my first comment. My second comment is this: did y'all see that film of Joe Biden in 2016 talking to the troops?
Yes, I think so. Is this the one where he's telling them to like clap you fools or something like that?
Yeah, he clapped you bastards. And he called them dog. Then he called them slow. Well, he gave you got to 30 me seconds that was like, wrong for that. Yeah, he was wrong for it. And he gave him an order to clap for him. That's why they started clapping for him. Not because they wanted to, because his joke failed. So he gave him an order, a command. Clap for me, you stupid bastard.
All right, Tariq, I'm going to have to end it here. Dude, thank you for the call, man. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to take a break. We will be back in a moment with Eleanor Goldfield.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our guest for this segment and the next, Eleanor Goldfield. She's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Censored, along with Lee Camp. Eleanor, how are you doing this morning?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. Better for having you with us. Thank you for joining us. We're having a conversation about sustainability in the environmental sense, but also, I suppose, in the civilizational sense, in a global sense, and capitalism, and whether or not they're sustainable, whether or not capitalism is sustainable, whether or not sustainability, whether the world can be sustained through capitalism. I'm getting my tongue tied over just a couple of different words here. Anyway, Eleanor, should be an interesting conversation. Can you please give us your take on this?
Well, I guess the better question is, how do you think that capitalism could be sustainable with the environment?
It can't be. It's impossible. There's no such thing as infinite growth. And capitalism literally depends on infinite growth. That's my comment. Exactly. I don't think they are. But I think you were going after Shane. So I'm going to let Shane get his response. I'm sorry, Shane.
No, totally. Yeah. I mean, so I have two takes of this. I'm of two minds, and ultimately I'm not a pro-capitalist. I'm not an anti-capitalist. I just don't know what's going to come after it, and I don't like the options that are on the table right now. The fundamental argument that capitalism is dependent on growth, on constantly reinvesting in growth, and on pursuing, fundamentally profits as something additional that you have to create out of what is, and that we have to sort of churn our world and extract its resources and damage the context within which all life grew up. I can see that argument. The other side of this, though, is technology, is that historically the thing that has helped us with that, and it's hurt in many cases too, but the thing that has in some cases helped us with that is the development of technology, which seems to be uniquely well developed under capitalism. That's at least my devil's advocate position, but genuinely, I don't hold on to that too strongly. I'd indict capitalism as well. But what do you think about that take with technology, Eleanor?
Well, so I guess the people who invented the wheel must have had a form of capitalism.
I was going to say the same thing, Shane. I was going to hit you in the same way. I'm sorry. Good. I'm sorry, Eleanor. Go ahead.
I think it's a big problem to suggest, and also sort of like and I'm not trying to throw you under the bus here, Shane. I'm just saying that it's a very modernist and kind of a Eurocentric perspective to think that that technology is a modern thing, whereas technology has always been something that humans have done. It's just that, it's recent that technology has included looking at cat videos on a computer that fits in your hand. So I think that the problem is to suggest that capitalism and technology necessarily go together, when actually, if you think about it, capitalism has really pushed technology back. And what I mean by that is everything that we appreciate about technology is done through collaboration. And collaboration is the antithesis of capitalism, because capitalism is all about competition, right? It's not about collaboration. And yet collaboration is why we have technology. If you think about what went into creating your phone, it was teams of people sitting around and figuring out, okay, we're going to have this and we're going to make this do this. How can we do this? Okay, you're the expert on that. You're going to take that and we're going to go over here and do this. It's a collaborative effort, which is really the opposite of capitalism. And it's why, like in design studios, you have people working together. You have people creating the ideas that then become something like a phone or, even a drone. And then, of course, the problem is that because of our military industrial complex, a lot of that technology goes straight to the military. So there's a thinking about technology that not only is it part of capitalism, but it's also inherent to this sort of empire and this imperialist paradigm that we in the United States hold. But really, that's not true. And technology can and would do a lot better in a different system. And to your point that you don't like the options on the table, well, capitalism is one of dozens, if not thousands of options. The options outside of capitalism are legion. It's just that we don't spend the time thinking or even creating them for the most part because we're so stuck in the cogs of capitalism. But that is not to say that we have to have capitalism. As Ursula K. Le Guin said, that capitalism seems insurmountable, but so did the divine right of kings. And we no longer have the divine right of kings. We have the divine right of the dollar. And I think that we can surpass that. And indeed, for a livable future, we must.
I agree that we must. And again, for me, fundamentally, it comes back down to what are we ultimately going to replace it with? I don't like the quote unquote socialism that's put on the table. It's typically advanced against capitalism. And I'll put it like this. What is the technology that poses the greatest threat to our world? As far as I can tell, over the last century, it's the nuclear bomb. And that nuclear bomb was developed through collaboration by a state, not by a private company, but by a state through the Manhattan Project. And it was proliferated around the world by competitions between states. Again, for me, it's not it's silly because we're making a dichotomy, which is I indict this all the time. We're making the modern dichotomy here between capitalism and socialism. Like you're saying, there's so many more things on the table. I have my own weird take, and I don't want to derail the conversation too much. I would indict capitalism at the level of money. I think that we need to seriously rethink. We need to come up with better systems. If you look at the origins of societies, they didn't use money. They didn't even barter. They were based on gift economies. With the internet, we could have something like that, a ledger that shows the things that people do for each other and creates a rich social network instead of, or as a surrogate for money. Again, that's my sort of weird parochial take on this. But more widely on this thing, we can't help but agree. I fall down on the same side as you on this one. Ultimately, again, capitalism, any society that is dependent on inevitable growth is going to have to change itself, or it's going to have to convince itself that it's growing when it isn't, which is arguably what's happened in the U.S. over the last 5 some odd decades. Despite a period of stagnation, wage stagnation, political stagnation, the breakdown of our institutions, we're seeing that increasingly going into this election. But again, we're getting a bit far afield here. I guess fundamentally, I think we agree. We can't live in a world for hundreds or thousands of years and maybe decades, tens of years at this point. We can't afford to live on a world if we're bent on runaway growth. But again, the question here is, what specifically should we be going for as an alternative? What's your take, Eleanor? Or Eleanor?
Well, I kind of take the route that a good friend of mine, Carla Bergman, who's the co-author of Joyful Militancy. I don't really have the answers. I just have questions. And I think one of the problems that I see is that people want so desperately to have the answer. But I don't think that the answer in a sort of political theory kind of way is important. Fred Hampton said, I can't say exactly what he said, but he said, theory's nice, but without action, it ain't blank. But the idea is that, like, instead of really getting into the weeds about which ism you might want or which, are we going to go democratic confederalism or, like that is fun to sit and have a few beers and discuss. But when it comes down to the reality of what we're building, I think the important thing is just to build it. And then you can call it merry if you want. You can call it whatever you want. And many people will argue about what it is called. But, for instance, in terms of, what a lot of mutual aid networks are doing around the world, not just around the country, is, they're building ways to not just not overthrow the government, but to make it obsolete. And so they're building their own autonomous communities. They're building ways to access food by, building community gardens. They're building ways to access medical care by collaborating with medical professionals. They're building wells. They have solar arrays so they can be off the grid. These sort of alternatives that make it so that we're building the future that we want to see without having to name it first. Because I think when you name something first and then you talk about how to create that, you get very much, even just speaking as like a writer or a musician, when you put yourself into a box and say, I have to write this song with these chords, you're going to feel very constricted, and it's going to feel not as your abilities and your capabilities to create something powerful are going to be limited. But instead, if you sit down with a community and you say, what do we want? What do we need? What are our demands? And then you start to build that, well, then you start building it. And the name of it doesn't really matter. And I think that's the important thing, is not to put the cart before the horse on this. And again, to have these theoretical conversations over a beer, but to not hamstring ourselves with them so that the future that we're building is stuck in this box and in many ways subject to replicating the hierarchies and the ills that we're actually trying to fight.
Eleanor, I'm just going to interject briefly to say I can't agree more. Jamarl's saying she sounds a lot like me. I talk about localism all the time, which is just another word for, you were talking about mutual aid, you're talking about building up local networks to try to help people get what they need and moreover get what they want. I agree with that completely, but I've been kind of dominating the conversation. Jamarl, what's your take?
Eleanor, why the failure? Now, I don't mean you personally. I just mean the environmental movement itself. And I say that with an increasingly worsening planet, with a West Coast that Shane fled from with fire on its heels, and flooding elsewhere. Not to mention, pandemics, everything else, and that stuff pretty much across the world. Like the heat waves, all that stuff is getting worse. The reports that the UN are putting out are getting more and more hair-raising. Even the number of species from the standpoint of the habitable environment have declined significantly so, and it took everything in them not to call it an extinction. The food that we eat, the things that we drink, those things have lost their nutritional quantity or quality because of the carbon in the atmosphere. There's so much it pushes the nutritional content down. Why hasn't the environmental community been able to make more gains than what they have? Our world is in mad straits. I guess that's what I'm getting at. And let's do this. Let's take an early break. And so I can give you a full-throated answer. I don't want to cut you off. It's like, 30 seconds. I don't want to do that. So let's give you a break. Let you collect your thoughts. Why the failure? You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. Thomas Stranahan. We have Eleanor Goldfield with us. Award-winning documentary filmmaker, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Censor with Lee Camp. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. Joining us today, we have Eleanor Goldfield, award-winning documentarian, filmmaker, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Censored with Lee Camp, another great guy. Her most recent documentary, Hard Road of Hope, covers past and present radicalism in the resource colony known as the state of West Virginia. Eleanor, we were getting into a question that I had, or that I have. I may know my own answers for that question, but I'm more so curious with yours, because you're somebody who's in the environmentalist movement, who have been pushing for these issues to be addressed. And if I make a basic point that I applaud you on, is that you make the connection of capitalism and environmentalism as opposed to dealing with it as a singular thing. Why do you think that the environmentalist movement have not been able to make as many gains as, say, like the civil rights movement, or even say from the standpoint of like the Occupy Wall Street and the 99%, like those things were seeming to make some level of gains. Even the civil rights stuff with the Floyd stuff, the Black Lives Matter movement, even some areas around the country have been able to show gains. Why not the environmentalist movement? Or am I wrong? Is the premise and the framing of the question wrong?
Well, I don't think it's wrong. I think it's too much of an umbrella. So, for instance, I think, first of all, with your point to the civil rights movement, I think it's important to recognize how malleable capitalism is. It's the same thing with LGBTQ rights. Why all of a sudden, LGBTQ folks can now marry, and 20 years ago, 30 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. And I think it's important, again, capitalism is a very rigid system in certain ways, but in other ways it's malleable. We want to, capitalism wants to make sure that there's enough space, there's just a little bit of headroom so that people feel like they're free, so that people feel like they have access to equal rights. Now, of course, if you actually look, of course, like systemic racism is still, incredibly widespread and horrific. Slavery never ended. It's actually in the amendment ending slavery, saying that it's not actually ended. So I think capitalism wants to give people a little bit of breathing room, just enough to make them feel like that they're free. And so this is something, when all of these protests were going on, Amazon put up Black Lives Matter banners, Netflix put up Black Lives Matter banners, everybody put up Black Lives Matter banners. They didn't mean it. But they can put that up there, and then they hope, we'll get more business because we are now with the flow of the, hashtag resistance. With environmental issues, it's different because the very core of our system is built on this extractive idea. It's built on the extraction and the destruction of the natural world. So to have an entire shift on that, a complete 180 would mean basically to dismantle the entire system, which is, of course, goes back to the point that capitalism and, a livable future are mutually exclusive. And I would say that while we haven't won, I think it's also important to recognize that there's no such thing as winning. You're never done fighting the forces of greed. You're never done fighting sociopaths. They're born every day, unfortunately. And until we have a sociopath test, we can't put them out to pasture somewhere. So I think it's, in terms of winning, in terms of failing, things would be a lot worse if people hadn't been fighting. So, for instance, just yesterday, this past weekend, there were huge protests in the Rhineland in Germany against lignite coal and fracked gas. And, thousands of people showed up to hold space and to keep them from destroying an old growth forest. A fracked gas pipeline that was slated to go through Virginia and West Virginia, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, has been canceled because of people doing tree sits and fighting. So the situation is bad. I absolutely agree with you. It would be a lot worse, though, had people not stood up or, sat down or locked down or what have you.
Totally fair.
I think fair. That is a very important thing to note. And with regards to with regards to Occupy and things like that, people say that failed. So I think it's really how you shift that and how we understand that climate change is now a conversation. People might say it's the conversation, and it's not an issue. It is the stage on which all other issues take place. And I think that is becoming more clear. And I think more and more people are pushing for that to become clear. And so in that sense, I wouldn't say it's a failure, but I would also highlight that, this is a very, very hard fight. And I think that, instead of saying that we're failing or that we have failed, we're instead saying that we're making small gains. It's not enough. And we must keep fighting, and we must keep engaging people to fight with us. But we have not failed.
Failing is provocative. I agree with you. And I meant it to be provocative, not as an indictment per se, if that makes sense. The question was meant to be provocative in the framing of the question. But that's fair. I understand it. I totally understand it. Some of the stuff gets subjective. But one point, and I'm sorry, Shane, let me interrupt once. I don't think this is the issue. And I think part of parcel to your answer here, where you made the point, you're making this kind of thing of capitalism, saying that, look, capitalism has a hard time dealing with environmentalism because one depends on sustainability, where the other one depends on extraction. And to be honest, our system doesn't even entirely place the environment into monetary terms when it's being exploited. Like, for example, you can get something ported across the world that ends up, there's this book, The Economy of Commerce, great book. And they make the point of how you can get something shipped from one side of the world to the other side of the world that person or that place can make easily. But they do it because it's cheaper to do it, because you don't necessarily apply issues associated with environment or environmental costs of doing business. So I agree with you. I guess my thing is, my disagreement comes in, it's the issue. I don't think it's the issue, because I don't think you can get anything done on this issue if you don't deal with the issues that people deal with in their immediate future. Like, I think you'd agree with me, this is a little esoteric, or it's kind of out there. It's an intellectual pursuit to some degree that every so often you may encounter, but you encounter it in a way where you don't necessarily know if it's still connected to the out there stuff. If you don't have food, for example, that's going to be your concern. And that's just order priorities. With the number of people that are out of work and everything else, would you agree that it is much more difficult to make the environmental case when there's anything else dealing or plaguing that person?
Absolutely. I agree with you. When people can't feed their families, when people are evicted, of course, they're not going to be worried about wildfires thousands of miles away. But I think that when I say it's the issue, I mean that it is the issue, just like it's the issue for our time, not that everybody cares about it most, which is unfortunate, but it's by design, right? When people are too sick and tired and overworked and underpaid, there's no way that they're going to be thinking about recycling. Even if they did, there aren't good recycling programs anyway.
But it's more insidious than that.
So I think
if you take your kid to McDonald's, let's say you're a grandmother, you think, I'm going to do something good for my kid. You take them to McDonald's. That grandmother doesn't care that the worker is paid minimum wage. She doesn't care that the animal was abused. She doesn't care that the gas that she's driving on and the food that she's eating, that hamburger, the largest contributors to climate. Like, it's just so much implicit. It's like implicit blame of sorts. Like, it's hard. It's a hard indictment. Like, how do people, and I think to some degree the environmentalist movement would have to get people to give up things that they like. And people, I don't know if they would. Am I wrong on that? Like, this goes both ways. This goes from the capitalist end in regards to their ability to produce. But this also goes to this kind of implicit bias towards having things that the public has. And so it's a hand in fist. And so there's no immediate impetus to do this stuff on climate, making it that much more difficult to get it done. Is that fair?
It is, but I think the other thing to think about is that 100 companies are responsible for 70% of all emissions. So this idea that it falls on people to drastically change their daily life, I don't think that's true. I mean, yes, we have to make changes, but I think it's also important to note that, first of all, humans are adaptable. That's why we're alive. And I think that if people have their basic needs met, and that's, of course, this is the if. If people have their basic needs met, then asking them to, not use plastic bottles, but use glass bottles that are easily accessible. But this is, of course, why climate change is not just the climate change issue. It's the access to, talking about food sovereignty. It's talking about making sure that people's basic needs are met, that they have access to health care. And, if we're still doing wages, that they have a livable wage, all of these things are a part of the climate change issue. And so, of course, that is absolutely true. But I think that, the personal side of climate change is, I think it's too often promoted either by the left or by the right to slap it down. When in reality, it's the system is the greatest polluter. Just the military itself, the United States military, is equal to 140 countries by itself. That's not even just the United States. That's just the U.S. military is equal to 140 countries when it comes to emissions. And so then to say that this person is the reason for climate change because they used a straw, that is just not an equal, that doesn't scan. So I think it's important. Yes, we should talk about personal choices, but the bigger issue here is not personal choices, but systemic choices and systemic issues.
And even on the level of the person, I mean, you can make arguments about consumerism and how under the current system, people are incentivized to produce more, maybe acting as surrogates for their emotional needs being unfulfilled. There are all sorts of different arguments you could make. I mean, my thing is, and I'm not going to harp on it, but I don't see it as a problem with capitalism per se. I see it as a problem with humanity's capacity to organize and its propensity to expand, and apparently to do so almost endlessly, where we keep growing. I mean, if you go back, Easter Island as a microcosm was not a capitalist society. It was just a runaway society. If you go back to the Arabian Peninsula, Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, these regions were once far more forested and with far denser, chains of life, chains of biology, DNA propagating with water. And obviously I'm sort of painting things in an extremely abstract sense, but it's kind of how I tend to think about things. Eleanor, here's my question. I'm optimistic, but it feels so far away. I'm optimistic about humanity's capacity to change as a species. And I think that in some sense, if we were in one phase where there was room to expand, and we're now entering another phase where there is no longer that much room to expand, and we have to sort of shift how our civilizations work on a deep level, I'm optimistic that we will make that change because, like you said, we're adaptable. I'm not going to push you for specifics because neither of us have them. There are so many different ways things could go, and frankly, I think that should be up to individual communities of people to choose. But do you share that optimism? Do you feel that sense, or do you look at things a little bit more bleakly?
I have hope, but I don't have optimism. And I guess maybe people might say that that's semantics, but I feel that optimism is the feeling that things will be okay. I don't think that things will be okay. I hope they are. But I think that the difference, and I think Cornel West talked about this probably much more eloquently than I'm going to, but it's the idea that, hope speaks to the idea that I have to do something to ensure that my hope is manifested. Optimism suggests that one could sit back and it will be okay anyway. Like you're optimistic on a flight that it's going to land because it always does. But I think that, the hope that I have is it's not the Obama style hope, but it's a hope that rests on what I've seen that humans are capable of. And yes, humans are great at messing things up and making things horrifying, but we are also great at making things beautiful and building something beautiful and sustainable. We've seen that just in our history, whether that be the Black Panthers or the labor rights movement or what have you. So I think that, I do have hope, but I think that we also have to be very realistic about the issues that we face, and some of the things that both you and Jamarl have brought up are really good points. And we have to look at this realistically. We have to look at all of the issues that face us. We have to look at all the tactics that are available to us. And we have to find ways to work together and not find excuses to divide.
Eleanor, I want to thank you for joining us. This was a great conversation. And by the way, I wasn't blaming people in that. I wasn't trying to in any way. I was joking my wife, telling her that throwing that can in the thing is great, to try to instill, but it's not like you said, 70% of that stuff is caused by only very few companies. But look, I want to thank you for coming on. This was a great conversation. Eleanor Goldfield, award-winning documentarian, filmmaker, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Censored, along with Lee Camp. Her most recent documentary, Hard Road of Hope, covers past and present radicalism in the resource colony known as the state of West Virginia. Eleanor, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right, so we're about to go into a break. In fact, we can go into a break now. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with headlines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back live, coming to you from across the divided states of America in the politically independent corner. I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host Shane Stranahan, Jamarl Thomas.
And together on that wall, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
You know, just to make a quick point about the wall thing, you know, anywhere you are is where you're at. And when we were talking about like first principles and economy and using technology for the benefit of humanity, that's an ideology. That's a wall. That's all I mean. Like, I don't mean anything like weird or anything strange. I just mean that.
Making me feel a little bit weird now that you said you don't mean anything weird, Jamarl.
Fair enough.
I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. I question you all the time about that. You know, in weeks past I've done that. So that's not coming out of nowhere for those listening. Anyway, I appreciate the clarification. All right, let's get into headlines. The New York Times yesterday published an expose on President Trump's tax return data, which it says paints a picture of a, quote, businessman president in a tightening financial vice, end quote. The New York Times says the data it was given shows chronic losses and years of tax avoidance, with Trump paying no federal income taxes in 11 of 18 years the Times examined, with his 2017 tax bill totaling only $750. You heard that right. Not $750,000, not $75,000, $750. The information they received reportedly includes details from both his personal returns and from the returns of the over 500 subsidiary companies contained within the Trump org, although the article quotes a lawyer for the Trump organization who disputed their analyst, saying that, quote, most of, if not all, of the facts appear to be inaccurate, end quote. The New York Times nevertheless holds that the documents are accurate and, quote, provided by sources with legal access, end quote. In an editor's note, the New York Times defended their decision to publish this stuff, saying that although, quote, some will raise questions about publishing the president's personal tax information, end quote, that, quote, the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that the First Amendment allows the press to publish newsworthy information that was legally obtained by reporters, even when those in power fight to keep it hidden, end quote. President Trump has as of yet only responded indirectly on Twitter by saying fake news in all caps several hours after the article was published. Again, there's no direct connection. He wasn't directly responding to it, but it's pretty clear this is the big bombshell story that got dropped this weekend. Really, the biggest bombshell when it comes to Trump and his finances in years, I would say, in terms of one big story. So, yeah, he was definitely replying to this. In related news on President Trump, he on Friday nominated Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court following the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg on September 18th. That was the Friday before last. Barrett is a circuit justice in the 7th District Court of Appeals and a one-time clerk for the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Confirmation hearings for Barrett will begin on October 12th, according to Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham. That's 2 weeks away from today. Graham has said that the Senate Judiciary Committee should approve her by October 22nd. In advance of her nomination, Democrats, including Senators Dick Durbin and Cory Booker, are calling for her to recuse herself from any Supreme Court decisions related to the election. House Democrats are planning to introduce legislation tomorrow which would add an 18-year limit to the terms of Supreme Court justices. The bill, titled the Supreme Court Term Limits Act and sponsored by Democratic Reps Ro Khanna, Joe Kennedy III, and Don Beyer, would provide for Supreme Court nominations in the first and third years after an election. While the bill may have a chance in the House, it is expected to fail in the Republican-led Senate. Tomorrow night, Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden and President Donald Trump will debate in the first debate between the two of this election season. Trump called on Twitter for Joe Biden to be drug tested before starting the debate, saying that, quote, his debate performances have been record-setting uneven, to put it mildly. Only drugs could have caused this discrepancy, question mark, end quote. Too much of that stuff. Anyway, interesting point that he's making. Just kind of coming out of left field for me. In our next headline, we spoke about this with Mark Sloboda for half an hour at 7:30, about an hour and a half ago. Go back and check that out. Azerbaijan and Armenia have each declared martial law following clashes in the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh that have killed at least 23 soldiers and civilians so far. Once a territory of the Soviet Union, following the USSR's collapse, the mountainous region of Nagorno-Karabakh became the site of the chief conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In 1994, the countries entered into a Russian-mediated ceasefire, permitting the creation of the Republic of Artsakh, de facto constituent of Armenia, which straddles almost the entirety of the region and which remains unrecognized by most countries around the world. On Sunday, the Armenian and Azerbaijani governments accused each other of firing shells into their territories, with Armenia claiming that the alleged attack was a declaration of war. Armenia has again declared martial law. Azerbaijan has declared partial martial law, and both countries have begun to mobilize for war. Armenia's prime minister called on Twitter for Armenians to, quote, unite to defend our history, our homeland, identity, our future, and our present, end quote. This is the largest flare-up between the two nations since the 2016 four-day war, which each country claimed as a victory. Longtime libertarian and retired politician Ron Paul appeared to suffer a stroke on Friday during a live recording of his Liberty Report. After he began slurring his speech during the live interview, Paul was admitted to a Texas hospital for, quote, precautionary reasons, end quote. He is now reportedly in good condition, with his son, Senator Rand Paul, saying, quote, thank God Dad is doing well, end quote. My last headline, an FBI agent assigned to former special counsel Robert Mueller's team has said that he thought the investigation into Michael Flynn was, quote, unclear and disorganized, end quote. William Barnett was the original case agent in the Mueller team's investigations into Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn. In an interview by the Justice Department on the 17th, Barnett said that the factual basis for the investigation was, quote, not great, end quote. He described a get Trump attitude in the special counsel's office and said that after 6 weeks, he was, quote, still unsure of the basis of the investigation concerning Russia and the Trump campaign working together without a specific criminal allegation, end quote. This came out, by the way, in a filing from the Justice Department early on Friday of this past Friday. This is, again, part of the investigation into whether or not the Justice Department should drop the charges against Michael Flynn. Back and forth with appeals and appeals and appeals. Turtles on turtles on turtles. That's headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. For those listening, the turtles on turtles on turtles reference, you probably know what that is, Jamarl, but it's just this idea that, you know, if his old myth that the world is resting on the back of a turtle, but whose back is the turtle resting on? And do you just suppose that there are turtles all the way down, which I think might have been the title of a Dr. Seuss book. Anyway, Jamarl, you want to talk about the Supreme Court? You want to?
That's like
exactly.
Scientists, they would come out. They said, you know, we don't believe in miracles, and then they would say, but we do believe in the Big Bang. It's like, give us one miracle and we'll solve the rest. Even the what are we expanding into? You know, the finite universe expanding into something else. It's like, what is that something else? Yeah, that's nothing. What do you mean it's nothing? Yeah, I feel you. Are there turtles all the way down? I even had this notion of the universes create other universes. Like, you know, one starts with a certain, you know, whatever material, and it creates something else. And then we start creating life from the standpoint of software, electronics. Do those electronic things create life that's something else? And does it kind of have this turtle on the back approach going all the way down in this kind of weird digital esoteric world or reality? That would be
there's also
fascinating.
There's also this idea. So yeah, I mean, if they're going to be created, it's probably going to be black holes. You know, if the universe creates other universes, I'm going to guess that it's something as weird and explanation defying and singular. I'll just say singular about the word about black holes. It would be something like black holes. But there's also this idea. Hugh Everett, the physicist, he's the main guy behind the multiverse theory.
Yeah,
which,
the many worlds.
You know, a substantial. Exactly, many worlds interpretation, which a substantial minority, I'm not going to say majority because it's definitely not, but a substantial minority of physicists actually do adhere to. And then the question there is, if you're constantly creating these multiple possibilities, isn't that a kind of creation? Isn't that this weird, like, inflation of matter going on all the time? How does that work with time?
Well, it depends on what you mean by
questions
matter.
Here.
It depends on what you mean by matter, right? Like, and what the perspective is of something that's non-physical of us. Like on Star Trek, what does Q look at humanity as? Like if Q was asked and he was sitting, he was explaining what humanity is. What would he say? How does he view them? Does he view humanity as solid from his perspective? Like that's kind of what I'm getting at. If there is something else, if there's an other, if this is being projected from some outside dimension, and you would get physicists saying that all the time. They would just say other. They're not going to say God, but they would say projected from elsewhere, or coming from elsewhere, or something like that. Then we could be, you know, sitting on somebody's desk somewhere. Like, it may not be, matter may not be what we see it as. It may be whatever the larger realm sees it as. Meaning, like, if you're looking at memory in a computer drive, and if a computer is looking at itself, let's say you had something that was a program that had the ability to think and reason and everything else, what would it see itself as opposed to the person who's just adding memory to the computer? Like, it's unknown.
It is true. It's something like a holographic theory or something like this, where the number of dimensions that we're seeing reality on is not the actual number of dimensions there, which, I mean, we should just take as granted at this point, because if you've looked into quantum physics recently, they admit many more dimensions than our mere four. It's not just the 3 dimensions of space and time. There are like kooky numbers of dozens of dimensions. A lot of weird questions there. With Everett, there's actually one lingering thing. Have you heard of quantum immortality, Jamarl? Look into it. This is interesting. So Everett hypothesized this. If you think about it, like if you from your perspective, if there are infinite numbers of these multiverses splintering off at any given moment in time, you're like more likely to continue to exist on the ones in which you continue to exist. You know, say in some of those universes you die, in others of them you live. You can look this up on Wikipedia. There's a whole article about quantum immortality. The idea here, and it's kind of a thought experiment really, but the idea here is that you're more likely to exist in the universes where you live, and in some of those universes you just keep living forever. So you're sort of drawn out along this increasingly improbable but nevertheless inevitable life. And it's a weird take. And honestly, that's one of the only ways. I mean, looking back at the last century with the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the worry that we all could have died, and kind of asking yourself, why didn't we die? Why were Hiroshima and Nagasaki the last like tactically used known nuclear weapons? I don't know, that's come to mind sometimes, but I don't genuinely hold to it. That gets a little bit solipsistic if you go too far. Anyway, you wanted to talk about the Supreme Court. I
wanted to talk about the Supreme Court. So, of course, the debate is coming up tomorrow. And on top of the debate that's coming up tomorrow, well, Trump, over the course of the week or so, or the next couple of weeks, will put in his pick, his Supreme Court pick, Barnett. Now, the question and the catch becomes, I would argue, that is a nuclear bomb. Now, why do I call it a nuclear bomb? Because Obamacare is in the courts right now. Is she going to sit on that court? And what is she going to say about Obamacare? Roe v. Wade may end up back in the courts. What is she going to say about Roe v. Wade being a Catholic? You know what I mean? There is, like, all of these things are on the chopping block. And so the question becomes, what happens? Whether she wins or loses, meaning whether Trump or Biden wins or loses, her impression, her stamp on the court could be dramatic in regards to what she may strike down or what she may allow. And so Democrats are out there screaming at the height of their lungs, oh, Jill Stein. Don't blame Jill Stein. Blame yourself. Blame Clinton. Blame Obama for being, too, I want to say incompetent, but I don't think it was incompetence. I think it was political laziness, where he wanted to use that to try to get people to vote for Clinton, Merrick Garland. And, not necessarily being too cool to try to get his pick through, with every exception of saying something bad about Republicans. I guess I'm saying Donald Trump has every power in the world to put her in office. He's not wrong for that. That's not a coup. That's the wrong word for it. That is called presidential discretion and using their good sense of saying we have the political power to do it, so they do it. The catch becomes, what does she do when she gets on that court? And beyond, what does she do when she gets on that court? Even if Joe Biden wins, you could have Obamacare struck down. You could have Roe v. Wade struck down. This is an interesting and ironic point, though. Medicare for All has 88% support among Democrats, 70% support among the rest of the population. We're in a pandemic with 30 million people who basically don't have health care, and roughly around the same amount that don't have a job and have stopped looking for or is not working. Medicare for All will be a massive pay increase to people who are working and getting a paycheck, because those are not medical bills they need to pay on the front part of that check anymore. It will be the highest amount of money dispensed in a generation. On top of that, the fact that you're in a pandemic where 7 million people ill or 6-point-something million people ill, it becomes that much more pressing and that much more imperative to have a policy like that. If Obamacare is struck down, which it rightfully could be with the Supreme Court pick, and the Democratic Party still says, we don't care what the public wants, we're not going to push for Medicare for All, that would be a worst case scenario, and it would be astonishing. And it's ironic. Like I said, With this much of the public backing Medicare for all, you can't get Democrats to back it. By the same token, Trump may end up striking down Obamacare. Let's talk about it when we get back. We're going to be accepting phone lines 202-521-1320. You guys are listening to Fault Lines.
Oh, no, we're talking to Garland. Garland.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Well,
and we're back. You're listening to...
No, go for it, Shane.
Okay, and we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're not taking calls this segment. We're going to take exactly one call hanging over from the last segment, but we're very happy to instead be joined by Garland Nixon coming up in just a minute. But first, let's go to Michael calling in from Silver Spring. Michael, real quick, what's on your mind?
Hey, I just had a question. If it seems that a lot of these issues boil down to a few things. I mean, if people care, I mean, my question is, which of the three options do you think is better for the humanity? To sort of suspend people's lives in these institutions like prisons and hospitals, to drop bombs on people in order, to sort of control the wave of humanity, or to give everybody in humanity $7 million while keeping prices the same, and then have people, sort of weed it out that way. Something to think about. What do you think?
Well, I mean, Michael, thank you for the call. Those first two options sound terrible, and that third option just sounds random. And I don't know how you can give everybody $7 million while keeping the prices the same. I think that would immediately cause inflation. But Michael, thank you for the call. Appreciate it. We are joined now by Garland Nixon, Sputnik analyst and host/co-host of the Critical Hour. Garland, how are you doing this morning?
Fine. Good morning, gentlemen. Great to talk to you again.
Hey, great to have you. All right. So New York Times just dropped this bombshell yesterday about Trump's tax returns. A long piece and a lot of information in there. A lot of this has already come out, but nevertheless, this, I would say, is the largest piece yet on Trump's financial information, his situation there, not just in recent years, but I would argue in history, in terms of how it might weigh on the election. But I'm going to go straight to you. Does this make a difference? The debate's coming up tomorrow night. What does this change, Garland?
I don't think it changes anything. So let me give you my immediate reaction. My kind of, as soon as I heard it, this was my gut reaction before I had a chance to think. My gut reaction was, the tax codes are rigged for the rich. Nothing shocking. Some rich billionaire paid no taxes. Jeff Bezos made $13 billion and paid nothing. There is nothing there that's shocking to me, number one. Number two, here was my second thought. You know what happened in 2013? 2013, they had something they were calling the fiscal cliff. And a part of that was the George W. Bush tax cuts. At the time, the Republicans were screaming, the deficit is going through the roof. 60% of the deficit was the Bush tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires. Obama signed those into law. Perhaps in hindsight, if Obama hadn't signed the Bush tax cuts into law, then Donald Trump would have had to pay more taxes. So my inclination is to look at it, and I'm no Trump fan. My inclination is to look at it like that. Hey, man, that's the rules. If you and me and Jamarl next year, if some law changed that would allow us to claim all kinds of stuff, to claim the oxygen that we breathe, and we didn't have to pay a dime in taxes, all of us would do it. Don't hate the player, hate the game. I'm no Trump fan, but hey, he played by the rules. And again, the rules are bad, not the players of the game. That's my thought. What do you guys think?
Well, we don't know entirely if he played by the rules. I mean, some of this stuff looks pretty egregious. Like it seems like he was dropping or aggressive tax hiding. Let's say it that way. And you're right. And I noted that earlier. Obama gave 83% of those Bush tax cuts, passed them through. And this was after, I don't know if people remember this. You remember this, Garland. When those tax cuts were first passed by Bush, Democrats bellyached. Oh, they're giving all of this money to the rich. They're giving all of this cash. And Obama puts through 80-something% of them and calls it a win. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, he said, we've increased taxes on the rich. Now, on top of that, you also made another good point. $72 million that Trump got back in like one windfall? And that $72 million came from the law that Obama signed into law and into office. And you're also right. Like, this is normal. I don't think people realize how normal this is. The richest 1% are responsible for 70% of all unpaid taxes. That's one thing. ProPublica published last year that the IRS now audits more poor Americans at about the same rate as the 1% due to the high costs of examining tax returns of the rich. That's because they've been undermining the IRS over the past few years, and undermining them and making it worse for the IRS. It makes it more difficult for them to do their jobs, which basically ends up with them not doing the jobs in regards to processing for the rich. I guess my point is, Garland, this is more normal than I think people realize. Not to mention this nugget. Unpaid taxes from 2011 to 2013 averaged around $381 billion per year. Couldn't that pay for education or childcare or some of these other policies that they always scream, how do you pay for that? And shouldn't we be doing more to change this? I mean, this is horrendous. Like you said, if it's legal, it's horrendously legal.
Well, let me add this. Here's an article from 2 weeks ago. Democrats back away from quick reversal of Trump tax cuts. Democrats are backing away from vows to reverse President Trump's tax cuts if they take control of the Senate and White House. So they signed the Bush tax cuts into law under a Democratic president. And now, after everyone screamed that, well, up until the bipartisan coronavirus bill, the Trump tax cuts had been the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of the United States to the wealthy. And the Democrats say, perhaps now that we might actually get power, we ain't getting rid of those tax cuts because our donors are benefiting from them. In the same way, in my opinion, that when Donald Trump stumblingly and bumblingly exposed that a big part of regime change is that the regime change monsters go into the country that after they change the regime and use corruption to pillage and loot the country by exposing Joe Biden and Hunter Biden's corruption in Ukraine. He accidentally did that, and the ruling elite went berserk because you're not allowed to expose the corruption in the ruling elite class. In the same way, they're going to make a little noise about this. They ain't examining Donald Trump's tax cuts. They're going to make some noise around the edges. And you said, if he did anything illegal, it's possible not. They won't touch him on that because Donald Trump's going to turn around to all of these billionaires and say, oh, really? You're going after? So it's time to go after the rich for tax cuts now, is it? How about we have a look at yours? They won't touch it. They're going to make some noise around the edge. They are all benefit. This is where they really have been able to do their financial transfers money from the poor to the rich. So this is just noise. They did it. Donald Trump's benefiting off of it. And this is just a ploy to go after Trump, in my opinion.
So Garland, you think from what you're saying, it sounds like you think Letitia James is basically a cul-de-sac, New York's Attorney General, who's been the main prosecutor pushing Trump on financial crimes here. She's not going to go anywhere with this. Is that where you're going?
I don't think it's going far. No, they're after Trump. They want Trump, but they won't touch him for things that will expose themselves. If you and I are bank robbers, I may try to get you for something else, but I don't want to expose that you're a bank robber because people are going to start investigating the string of bank robberies. And guess what? I did half of them and you did half. I don't want anybody investigating bank robberies in the area when I'm a bank robber too. So, no, a lot of this show stuff, they ain't going to go after Trump. But so, look, let me give you an example. Remember Donald Trump's, his foundation, his nonprofit, and they found all of these shenanigans going on, and they said, oh, we're going to get Donald Trump for his foundation and nonprofit. Where'd that story go? Gone. Anybody heard? Did they go after him? And that was New York supposedly going after him. Why didn't they go after him? And you guys and I know as well as you guys know as well as I do. What do super wealthy people do? They start a nonprofit and they use it for money laundering. They ain't going to open that door. They're not going to crack that door because they're all on the other side of it. So to me, okay, Donald Trump played the game by the same rules that they played the game. My problem with Donald Trump's policies have to do with war and foreign policy and issues of race and various things that I don't like. But as far as the Democrats, let me add this, they got no platform. What do they have? Even if they are able to denigrate and vilify Donald Trump, they're not presenting a viable alternative. I think it's enough murder. I think they make noise out of it. The resistance is going to be excited, and then that's going to be it.
That is, yeah, the resistance will continue to moan, but that's just kind of what they've been doing. And I mean, I can't help but agree with you. A pox on all of their houses. If only I had that much money to waste, I'd probably be a much worse, but a much worse person. I'll just put it that way. Anyway, here's the thing, though. If this isn't practically going to change things, is this just optical? How do you think this is going to change the electorate going into debates tomorrow night? Do you think this is going to matter in that sense, or is this just whistling in the wind, Garland?
I think after the debate tomorrow, it won't be much of a story, except like Russiagate, except the people who already, that all you have to say is Donald Trump and their hair catches on fire. Oh, they'll go nuts. I mean, I've talked to people and said, well, I don't see, I've said basically what I've said to you and had people say, but if he violated the law, he should be, I said, if, well, you know what? If my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. So if the best that someone has against Donald Trump is if he violated the law, well, if he robbed the bank, he should be prosecuted for bank robbery. I don't think there's anything here. I think the resistance will freak out, but that's what you do if you're in a resistance, you freak out. I think it's in the job description. And after tomorrow night, I tell you what the story's going to be after tomorrow night, whether or not Joe Biden's cognition is up to par. They'll forget about this. If it ain't up to par, it's a huge story. If it is, it's even a bigger story.
Well, if Trump has already said he wants him drug tested, just to make sure, I got to be wrong. To be fair, I don't blame him for putting that out there. It's funny, and to some degree, true. What I mean is the cognition thing. I mean, Joe Biden in the recent debates, he was horrendous. That is a different person. He's like a wisp of a man that he was just 4 or 5 years ago. What do you think is going to happen in that debate? Do you think he withstands what it is to be Trump? Or is it like other presidential debates where the first debate that the president has, the president usually gets a shellacking because the president is the president for the last 3-4 years and doesn't necessarily have to deal with somebody going after him? So what do you think happens in this? Is Trump going to collapse, or do you think he's going to mop the floor with Biden? And by mop the floor, I just mean it's going to be a brutal debate for Biden, and he's not going to come out looking good. That's what I mean by that.
Well, that's the latter. I don't think Biden does well. Look, they're going to have to pump Biden full of steroids or some kind of medicine, or bring in a shaman and 3 or 4 witches to come up with a spell to get this guy's brain right, because there's something clearly he's not mentally steady and efficient right now. And if he goes in there and starts bumbling and stumbling over his words and forgetting things, unlike Bernie, Donald Trump will tear him limb from limb. If Donald Trump smells blood in the water, he'll go after him. And he will use the most powerful weapon that you can use against somebody, pity. He'll use pity. Rather than tear him apart, he'll basically say, oh, poor Joe, I'm sorry for Joe's having problems. Perhaps we should have somebody come on stage and help out Joe, blah, blah, blah. He will. So I would expect Biden at best, because I think against Bernie, I think they had him pumped full of steroids or something. At best, he'll make maybe the first hour, and as he did with Bernie, and then start falling apart. And when he starts falling apart, he's going to have big, big problems. If I'm betting on the game tomorrow, I'd pick Trump by 2 touchdowns.
If I'm betting, I'm going to do an over-under. I'm going to choose 100 fumbles, and I'm definitely going to go over 100 fumbles on Biden's part. The only exception to that would be if it's just problematic from beginning to end, in which case I don't know how you would break that up if he's just constantly mumbling and over talking himself and saying words that don't exist, that kind of thing. No, legitimately. Garland, thank you for joining us. What are you guys going to be talking about on the Critical Hour later today for folks who want to listen in?
Stories on Cuba. We're going to Iran, some foreign policy stuff, some coronavirus stuff. You know, the big stories that you missed from over the weekend, Monday morning, that you're waking up to, that people are discussing today. The end of the day, we'll be touching on them all. We'll be, talking about them, and we'll be adding the little extra things that came out today. It's going to be a great today, 6 to 8 p.m. on Radio Sputnik, the Critical Hour with me and Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Absolutely. Garland, thank you again for joining us. For those listening, that was the voice of Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. As he said, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. We're going to be back in just a minute with Tom Luongo. Stay tuned.
Fault lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. There have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest this segment and the next, Tom Luongo, founder of the Gold Goats and Guns newsletter. We have him on frequently. Tom, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning, Shane. Good morning, Jamarl. How are you guys? How you been?
Good, and better for having you with us. Yeah, for those listening, Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst, founder and publisher of the Gold Goats and Guns newsletter. And by the way, you can follow him on Twitter, TFL1728. TFL1728 on Twitter. You can also read his articles. Just go to tomluongo.me and you can subscribe to his monthly newsletter on Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns. By the way, that is an N as in the letter, not the word, Gold Goats and Guns. Tom, again, thank you for being with us. Wanted to have you back on, and I saw an article on your website that struck my fancy, so to speak. What is, you're making the case that Trump is trying to break the UN, basically with these snapback sanctions over the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran deal. What's your take here? What do you think is the ultimate end goal here? If this is a game, what are the win conditions? What's the lose condition? What are the factors here, Tom?
Well, it's funny, Shane. I knew that we were going to talk about this morning, so I reviewed that article that I wrote. And sometimes I write stuff simply because my spidey sense is telling me this is what I think is going on. And then you, like, during the process of writing the article, you kind of put yourself in a position where you can, like, start to take everything that's you see happening and taking shape and then try and build a through line and a narrative. Sometimes I do this and I don't even believe what I'm writing. And I do it on purpose as an intellectual exercise because it's the only way to remain kind of neutral and objective as an analyst, right? In this particular instance, though, I may be overstating the case a little bit. I do think that this is what Trump's plan is. I think from the beginning, if you look at everything he's actually accomplished as president, and he hasn't accomplished much or as nearly as much as we would have liked for those of us who voted for him. But what I do see, a very consistent through line, is an attack on the post-World War II institutional order, right? The WTO, the UN, the European Union, all of these institutions, as they attempt to morph them into effectively, for the next generational cycle, a global government. And this is what's kind of behind the entire plan. If you sit back and take a look at what's happening post-COVID-19, post all of this stuff, it's very obvious that the EU is pushing for further integration as a model for how we're going to have non-traditional nation state governmental politics, right? Government structure. The European Union is designed from the ground up not to be a nation state. And Trump is first and foremost a nationalist, whether you agree with his view of how we should go about it or whatever. Ultimately, guys like Trump, Putin, Viktor Orban, Salvini, Farage, they're all sovereigntists at a certain level, and if not explicitly. And they're the ones standing athwart this push for what effectively winds up being a global, transnational legal infrastructure through international law, through treaties, through the large treaties and the rest of it. And Trump has just nixed all of that. I mean, the first thing he did when he got into office was he nixed the TPP and he nixed the TTIP, right? And then he pulled out of the Paris Accord on climate change. And those set him in pure opposition to what I like to call the Davos crowd. And those are the people that meet at the World Economic Forum every year at Davos and, think they're going to set the future plan for the world. And it just seems very clear to me that he's pursuing snapback sanctions on Iran and against Nord Stream 2, the pipeline. The amount of damage he's doing in those in these fights that he's picking he's attempting to undermine the structure of all of these institutions, undermine the structure of the EU by setting Germany against the rest of the European Union. Setting factions within the United Nations Security Council against each other and forcing them in effect to vote against their own resolutions. So it's a very strange thing, but Trump loves chaos because he has a plan. I do believe he has a plan in his head, and he likes to create the appearance of chaos or just actual chaos because that's the best way during a negotiation for him to make his opponents make a mistake, overcommit to a bad pot or whatever metaphor you want to use. But he always has his eye on the prize, and his eye on the prize here is regaining U.S. sovereignty. And in his mind, he feels that we've given up too much of that over the course of the past two generations, which is why he ran for president in the first place and why he wants to be reelected. So I'm not saying I agree with all of it, but I'm just saying that this is, I think, what his plan is.
When Trump, there's a few parts I want to pick at with this. Mm-hmm. When Trump first started running, it's more likely that he was running to increase his brand, not necessarily to quote unquote fight the globalists. And some of this stuff, I agree with some of it, I think, but some of it I think I disagree with. The Iran thing, for example, look, the pipeline. Trump was always against Iran. This wasn't to break up a global thing. He was always belligerent towards Iran from the moment that he got into office, attacking the JCPOA, if I'm not mistaken, even beforehand. Sure. Am I wrong? Sure. Tell me if I'm wrong on either of those points.
No, it's not, and I think that's also part. I disagree with you about his motivation. I don't think if Trump wanted to increase his brand, he didn't have to do it by becoming president. I'm dead serious.
What else
he didn't need.
Because at that point,
it doesn't matter. It's not brought his brand any strength. I'll be honest with you. It's cost him more money than it has anything else. So I would argue against that. I just would. I know that's a popular position on what amounts to the left of the political spectrum or Trump's opposition, and that's fine. I disagree with it. I think that Trump made it abundantly clear that this is why he's running, because he's been very consistent going back to interviews he gave in Playboy back in the 80s about what he thought we were doing wrong as a country, and he was setting the groundwork back then for a political career late in life. I'm dead serious.
Well, I don't doubt.
I just don't see.
Just to be clear, I don't doubt that he's a nationalist at all. Meaning, whatever was in his head on the reasons for running, those things are partial to Trump. So fair enough. So I do think he has this kind of perspective of this kind of nationalistic perspective. I don't necessarily think that's a through line, though, into his actions in regards to policy like, for example, Nord Stream 2. He just wants to get his hands on the contract. I mean, there are things that Trump does.
No.
You don't think so? You think it's entirely in order to fight this kind of globalism?
I think he could have easily cut a deal to allow Nord Stream 2 to go through if Germany was willing to give him enough money. Look, if Germany was willing to give him enough guarantees to say, hey, okay, because look at what Merkel's done in order to try and appease Trump in the last 2 years to get Nord Stream 2 across the finish line while it was being built. First, she committed to a major LNG import terminal in Germany. And then she just came out the other day and said, look, Germany's willing to invest $1 billion in the LNG sector in the United States as an opening offer to Trump. Trump did not counter with, no, I want $10 billion. If it was just a transactional thing, Trump would have countered with $10 billion. They'd have settled on $5 billion and been done with it. No. This is policy for the United States. Opposition to Russians providing Germany gas has been a hallmark of American foreign policy going back to the Kennedy administration. Okay, this is nothing new. It's just the policy inertia. Now, Trump, I think, takes that one step further and uses that to further what he thinks is the real problem. That's where this is. In the context of the opposition to Nord Stream 2, this is the inertia of American foreign policy coming out of the Pentagon, coming out of the military-industrial complex, coming out of the State Department, and coming out of West Point. I mean, these guys the graduates of West Point today are still being trained in Mackinder Heartland theory about how the world operates, which is why he's against Iran and all that stuff, because Iran is the linchpin to China's Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia and all of that. So I hear what you're saying. I just don't think that those are the primary motivators. I think those are motivators. I just don't think they're the primary motivators. The primary motivators, this is I think where we're disagreeing, is as to what his priorities actually are. And I think Trump is a sovereigntist first, and he was willing to do and he puts everything in a very simple calculus. If it's bad for the United States, I'm going to be against it. And I'm not saying that's a great way to go about conducting foreign policy. I'm just telling you that's how I see him after observing him for 4 years.
I can see some of that too. So Tom, I'm curious. You painted a picture of Trump in opposition. I mean, of course, we brought you on to talk about this exactly in opposition to the UN, also in opposition to what you're calling the Davos crowd. You brought in West Point there. I'm sure there's some vestiges of the military intelligence from the U.S., the UK, and other nations abroad. What are they holding on to? If Trump is pushing for sovereignty, what would you put as the opposition's take? What do they want? I see it. I'll give my brief take here. It's just holding on to power, holding on to supply lines in terms of being able to invest and maintain their investments. It's that kind of thing. It's not that there is so much a concrete agenda that they're pushing for, is that they're trying to preserve their interests. But Tom, what's your take?
No, I think there's a very concrete agenda. I think that concrete agenda is the subjugation of China, the subjugation of Russia, the subjugation of the United States under the will of under the will of what effectively are a bunch of European elites. And that comes out of, and it's centered on the UN, and it's centered on Europe, and it's centered on NATO, and all of that. That this is a very clear thing that they are doing with the COVID-19 lockdowns and everything else. To hollow out the middle class here in the United States, to destroy the lower middle classes in the United States through lockdowns and political turmoil, to make the United States uninvestable and everything else, and to destroy what's left of the middle class here in the United States, and certainly in the UK. They've already destroyed it in Europe. They've already destroyed the middle class in Europe. Europe is falling behind technologically. Europe used to be a technological marvel, and Germany has been managed by Angela Merkel to the point of not even being a leader in anything anymore. I mean, what's Germany a leader in? Cars? Not really. I mean, there's great German industrialism, but that great German industrialism has just been sacrificed on the altar of expedient mercantilist policy of exporting goods within Europe using the euro as an unfair currency advantage. And that's what they've done. So, when you look at it from that perspective, it's pretty obvious that we are looking at that we want to maintain. They want to maintain NATO because we're paying for all of it. They want to maintain the UN because we're paying for a lot of it. They want us to pay for the WTO and all of this stuff and institute draconian. I mean, look at what Biden's got on offer, and it's very obvious what the plan is. It's going to be more draconian and onerous taxation on the middle class and hollowing out of and treating capital even more poorly than it currently is. Because look, at the end of the day, the WTO and the OECD are designed from a policy perspective for tax normalization, which means that whoever the worst major actor is on the global scene in terms of international capital, how it treats it, that's what everybody has to be brought down to, as opposed to them having to reform themselves to become better. So France, with its ridiculously bad tax policy, their goal is to make the United States look like France in order to level the playing field, because that's what the EU is talking about when they talk about a level playing field. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The European Union is the model by which the West is to be organized and used as like California for the rest of the world. As I've said before, every bad idea in the United States starts in California because of its economic power and then translates itself east. Well, the European Union is the same thing. Okay, it's everything.
Tom, we've got to go to a break. We're hitting a hard break here. Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst and publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. We will be back with him in just a minute on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
This is Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. I am here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We're joined by geopolitical analyst and publisher of Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter, Tom Luongo. Tom, I agree with you that the European Union, they're trying to pull these places in, or pull the various countries in to behave almost like states. And, even though it started off as this kind of cartel of sorts. I don't necessarily know if it exceeds to the rest of the world, even though I would also probably agree that you would have certain leaders who have ideas and inclinations of expanding their power base. But the United States also has a policy. I mean, our policy is military domination of the globe, and to not have any other countries be to the tune of the Soviet Union that is going to compete with us. What is the difference between the U.S. plan of domination versus the EU plan of domination? I guess I don't see why the EU's plan. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. No. It's a fair question. I mean, it truly is. Here's the thing. Both are powers that are in decline, desperately trying to hold on to the past glory. All right. And that's the big one. Both are embroiled in a battle for the future of who should be in charge, one way or the other. Why the United States is better than the European Union is simply because we still have a vestige of a system that's in place that respects individual rights at a legal level. That does not exist within the European Union. The European Union, it does not have representative government. It is an appointed government of technocrats. Okay. It's not saying that the United States is some shining house on the hill or anything. I spend most of my life writing articles about why we've abandoned those very laudable principles on which the country was founded, right? And even blowing open some of the myths and narratives of the founding of this country, certainly. But within the framework of what we have available to us, our choices for the models are pretty simple. What the United States still has the vestiges of what the European Union has on offer, or what China has on offer. And neither of those, as far as I'm concerned, as a libertarian or even just as a person who believes in the sanctity of human dignity, should want either what the European Union is offering or what China is offering. Because the European Union is offering the USSR as run by Germans. That's pretty much the most succinct way I can put it. You have a Politburo that's unelected. You have a legislative body that's supposedly representative of all the nations, but they have no legislative power. They can only advise. You have no direct component. All of the people who make all of the decisions within the European Union are insulated from actual populist
No, Tom, I totally
concerns,
agree with you.
and it's horrific. And at least the United States, while it's functional and in practical terms, a corrupt oligarchy with massive barriers to entry for new parties to get into the political scene and all the rest of it. And we can spend hours discussing what's wrong with the United States, but the vestiges of the system are still there in order to give the people their voice.
Agreed.
Now, is that voice going to be available to everybody equally? Of course not. I'm not playing, I can't play principle games here. It's not the world I want. It's the world I got. The very fact that Donald Trump is president tells us that we still have a vestige of that.
No, Tom, I wasn't getting to the thing of better or worse. That's not where I was going with it. I was getting more so into this notion of states and powers have ideas about power and accruing it, meaning growing it. And so whether that's the U.S. saying there's not going to be another nation like the Soviet Union and using political, military, and propagandistic power to do those things, whether it's going after Huawei or anything else. I'm just making the point that powers have a tendency to want to expand. And I was making this kind of thing of, this is our policy. Why is it strange that it will be a EU policy also? That's kind of where I was going with that. It wasn't a comparison between the EU. Yeah,
you're right. And you're right, Jamarl. That's a very good point. And I didn't completely address it. So I'm going to address what's really happening here. So the EU has aligned itself with the people who want to do away with even any vestiges of the nation state, because they fundamentally believe that the individual nation state is the source of strife in the world. And so what they actually want is a transnational legal overstructure that does away with any attempt at local populations having any control over the future. It's what Jean-Claude Juncker, the former former president of the EU Commission, said very succinctly. There can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. These people believe that treaties are far more powerful than anything else in the world, and that the treaties, and then they own the courts to enforce the treaties, right? And so that whole process, that's what Trump stands against. Okay, that's what. I believe that. I don't know that he always gets, he actually, pushes the ball forward properly, right? I don't think he's a great quarterback for this, right? For this, this counteroffensive.
By and large, Tom, I could push back in different ways on different. Sure. Even the JCPOA, for all it had problems, but arguably that would have been a step forward in terms of reducing military tensions globally, which it's a whole complicated thing. But here, I actually want to come back to something you kind of passed over this briefly. You said. I basically recorded this as a quote because I really wanted to come back to it. You like to think about the myths and narratives of the founding of this country. What were you talking about? Tickled. Yeah. Tom, please go into it.
Remember, I'm no fan of Hamilton, right? I'm no fan of Alexander Hamilton, and I'm no fan of what we had at the end of, I'm not a fan of the Constitution. I'm a fan of the Articles of Confederation, even though I understand historically within the context, we had to do something to consolidate the debt in order to pay it off, in order to allow the country to finally come together. I get it, and I understand what Hamilton was trying to do. But what Hamilton was trying to do was to recreate the King of England here in the United States with, kind of a democratic republic, with the veneer of a democratic republic, but with the president being a king. And I think I think that a lot of these myths, and about obviously the founding fathers weren't as pure as the driven snow, and they weren't only interested in liberty and everything else. But at the same time, they were complicated men. But at the same time, they weren't wholly evil either, right? They understood that slavery was a problem that had to work itself out. It was ingrained deeply in the fabric of the society, and it was going to take a long time for it to work itself out. And they needed to make compromises and all the rest of it. But we have kind of mythology built up around the United States based around our founding documents, which we have never, as a country, we haven't practically lived up to. And those are the things we need to be, as patriots, we need to be able to talk about them honestly and then figure out how we're going to recapture that, because we're not there now. We've made the transition from federated republic of states to an empire after that process started when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. I say this all the time. Okay. And we've been on that path ever since. And to Jamarl's point that, governments always want to consolidate power and expand and everything else. So we can have the bigger discussion about that.
But in our case, in America, it happened a lot faster. You're talking about the transition from a republic to an empire. It happened a lot faster for us than it did for Rome. And maybe you could attribute that just to the faster pace of modernity or something like this. But here's the thing. I am fundamentally in agreement with you. I've given throwaway comments about like Jeffersonian agrarianism or whatever, just a variance of localism, which I think America seems uniquely able to provide on not a world scale, but on our scale. It seems like you have embedded in our institutions this like respect for the dignity of local communities and individuals, specifically the smallest nub of that. But here's the thing. I'm going to push back on that, even though it's my take, because I want to get your response. There's this other argument, which is if you get that, then what you get effectively is anarchy. What you get is either within the country, wars between the smaller societies, or on a larger scale, America as a unit, unable to defend itself against foreign aggression. I mean, that is always, as far as I can tell, it's either, like you're saying, consolidating the country to pay off its debts, or it's consolidating the country to either antagonize against or defend against some other country. Do you see what's your resolution for that? Again, you're a practical person, but you're also toying with these ideas. Do you think there's any way out or any hope of like saving that localism, or is it just going to be world unilateralism by the UN or some other intragovernmental organization?
No, I think that the push towards international government is going to fail completely because it's built on a foundation of funny money, lies, debt, and unsustainable economic expansionism that is fueled by a Ponzi scheme fueled by Ponzi scheme on top of Ponzi scheme on top of Ponzi scheme. And what bothers me about the modern left is that they label that capitalism and then, offer the antipode of Marxism as the solution. And that's where I think the problem. We're not going to go through that. We're going to go through a very ugly authoritarian period of time here, starting now and moving probably for the next 10 or 15 years for a variety of reasons: culture war, political war, this war, all of these things. All of these systems that we've built over the last, couple hundred years, going back to honestly the founding of like the Bank of England and the first central banks and all that stuff. I think that we're going to see this whole period of history culminate, and it's going to be ugly and it's going to be violent politically. I don't know how. Hopefully, it'll be as unviolent as possible in terms of the loss of human life, of course. But this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a paradigm shift in political thinking and in institutional order and institutional organization. And human beings go through the process kind of like Churchill said about the Americans. They eventually they try everything else and then eventually they come to the right decision. Well, it's kind of like the way human society is organized in general. We try out every bad idea, and then we move, and then we explore it to its its end, and then we look for the next one. I think we're reaching a peak of this. I think we're reaching a peak of can we create the collectivist power of this version of the collectivist power of the state to achieve political and social goals that are salutary. I don't think I think we've reached the peak of that. And I think we're going to have the breakdown. And I think it's going to be I think after this transition period, I think the world afterwards will be a better place because technology is moving us towards decentralization of power. It always has. It's been doing it for thousands of years. It's going to continue into the future, but it's going to do so in cycles and waves. It's not going to do so in a kind of linear through line.
1 minute.
There may be a linear through line, on a statistical average that we're moving towards individual freedom and towards individual respect, but we're going to do so by failing and, as we always have, by exceeding our expectations and then underachieving expectations and, in a cyclic, but I think upwardly sloping,
It almost sounds Hegelian, Tom. It almost sounds Hegelian. Almost. All right. Tom Luongo joining us, geopolitical analyst and publisher of the Gold Goats and Guns newsletter. Tom, thank you for being with us.
Sure. Thank you guys for the invitation as always. You guys have a great day.
Hey, thank you. You too. All right. For those listening, You can follow Tom on Twitter at TFL1728. Check out his articles at tomluongo.me and subscribe to his monthly newsletter if you'd like. You can check that out at patreon.com/goldgoatsnguns. Again, N, the letter N. We're wrapping it up. Today, a great show. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thanks, Engineer Andre. Thanks, Producer Raheem. And thank you to my great co-host, Jamarl Thomas. Be back tomorrow. Hope you folks have a great day.
All right, guys, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the books. Really interesting show for today. You guys are going to see me a little bit later on. And so I'm going to say goodbye here. Well, you're going to see me later on, probably after 12. But let me just make sure. Nothing screwy. Yeah, shout out to my co-host Shane, man. Great. Yeah, great show. Like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in a couple of hours. Thanks all.